The day Master Qin's long-lost biological son was finally brought back to the family. Everyone was holding their breath eagerly waiting for my chaotic breakdown. Yet I merely stood there in absolute silence on the second-floor corridor, watching the servants frantically hustle in and out, completely redecorating the bedroom that once belonged entirely to Qin Huan. That particular room boasted the absolute best natural lighting in the mansion, complete with a stunning spacious balcony, and I hadn't even lived in it for a full month yet. My mother tiptoed up to my side with extreme caution, her nervous fingers anxiously twisting the silk tassels of her elegant shawl, as she spoke in a voice that was incredibly soft and hushed. Mufeng, you see, Huan has always absolutely adored the sunlight in the master bedroom. So do you think you could move into the guest room instead, oh? I didn't even bother waiting for her to finish her sentence, cutting her off instantly mid-word. My own voice sounded so hauntingly calm that it felt entirely foreign to me. I can pack up and clear the space for him right this second. They both froze in sheer disbelief, clearly never expecting me to surrender everything so easily and without a fight. My father parted his lips slightly, as if desperately trying to search for some comforting words to soothe me. But in the end, he merely gave my shoulder a heavy, helpless pat. We've truly wronged you, Mufeng. I forced a faint, hollow smirk, not planning to argue. Wronged? What was there left to feel wronged about? Over these past 5 miserable years, I had already grown completely numb to it all. The very next day happened to be my birthday. My fiancée Jian Shijie had already booked a dinner date with me the whole week in advance, securing a reservation at my absolute favorite fine dining French restaurant. I arrived a full half-hour ahead of schedule, taking my seat right next to the window, quietly watching the city's neon lights flicker to life one by one outside. By the time the waiter approached to refill my water glass for the 3rd time, his gaze was filled with unmistakable, agonizing pity. Finally, my phone vibrated and began to ring. It was Jian Shijie. I pressed answer, and a wave of chaotic, noisy background chatter flooded through the receiver. Her voice came through, laced with obvious panic and overwhelming guilt. I'm so incredibly sorry, Mufeng. Huan somehow got completely lost inside the shopping mall, and his phone battery died unexpectedly. I only just found him now, and it's already so late. I don't think I can make it to the restaurant anymore. How about we reschedule for another day? I gripped the phone tightly in my hand, as my fingertips slowly grew ice cold. Go ahead and take care of him. I'll just eat by myself. Please don't be angry with me. I'm truly not angry at all, I said, cutting her off instantly. My voice remained eerily perfectly calm. Just drive safely. The moment the call disconnected, I signaled the waiter over to my table and ordered a single-person set menu. I didn't even bother asking for the birthday cake. I finished the meal in utter silence, paid the bill, and walked out. The freezing wind outside the restaurant entrance slammed ruthlessly against my face, prompting me to pull my coat collar up high, as I walked back to the parking lot entirely alone. On the 3rd day, Jian Shijie's medical checkup results were released. She was officially 6 weeks pregnant. The news was broken to me by my parents and her together. The 3 of them sat rigid on the living room sofa, their faces masked with the exact same expression of awkward conflict, yet underscored by a chilling, absolute determination. My mother spoke up first, her eyes already welling up with tears. Mufeng, this child absolutely cannot be kept. My father nodded solemnly from the side, his tone incredibly heavy. The moment Huan found out Shijie was pregnant, he locked himself in his room and sobbed hysterically the entire night. He said he's terrified that once his baby is born, there will be absolutely no place left for him in this house. The boy is still young, and his emotions are incredibly fragile and sensitive. I shifted my gaze toward Jian Shijie. She sat there in total silence, buried in the single-seater armchair, her hands tightly clasped together and resting on her knees, her fingertips turning a ghostly white from the sheer pressure. After a long pause, she finally raised her eyes to meet my gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. Yet every single word cut through the air with absolute clarity. Mufeng, back then when you and Huan were accidentally swapped at birth, you became my official fiancé by default. But Huan, he has already suffered and endured far too much. Now that he has just barely returned to us, his psychological state is understandably volatile and unstable. Seeing me pregnant is genuinely a massive, overwhelming blow for him. She paused for a brief moment, looking as if she had just braced herself for a devastating decision. We can always have another baby in the future, but right now it truly isn't the right time. I sat there quietly listening to them chime in one after another, every single word entirely centered around Qin Huan's endless grievances. It was as if Jian Shijie conceiving my biological child was somehow a catastrophic, twisted mistake that desperately needed to be corrected. How absolutely pathetic, and there they were all holding their breath, waiting for my reaction. Yet I merely reached out with absolute composure and picked up the medical report resting casually on the coffee table. I gave a simple mechanical nod. All right. When is the surgery scheduled for? Today. In that case, I'll accompany Shijie to the hospital right now. The moment the words left my lips, I stood up, grabbed my coat from the back of the chair, and gripped Jian Shijie's wrist, pulling her straight toward the exit. Mufang, my mother froze in utter bewilderment, subconsciously calling out to halt my steps. You're just agreeing to this just like that. My footsteps came to a sudden halt, and I tilted my head back slightly. Otherwise, what else do you expect? My father also looked completely lost and flustered. Don't you have any other thoughts or feelings about this key? I turned around, entirely fixing my gaze on them. Do my thoughts even matter? The corners of my mouth twitched into a forced smirk, and I knew that smile must have looked utterly hideous. If I said I desperately wanted to keep this child, would any of you actually change your minds? What? The entire living room plunged into a suffocating dead silence. I didn't bother wasting another second waiting for an answer, tugging Jian Shijie along as I continued walking out the door. From right behind us, a flurry of panicked, frantic footsteps echoed. In the end, they still scrambled to follow us out. Inside the hospital, the pungent, stinging stench of disinfectant filled the air. Jian Shiji finished changing into her surgical gown, and just as she was about to step through the doors of the operating room, she abruptly spun around and fiercely gripped my wrist. Her grip was incredibly intense and desperate, her fingernails digging so deeply they almost punctured my skin. Are you seriously this eager and thrilled to let me go through with this surgery? Her voice was stretched incredibly tight, practically vibrating with tension, and her eyes locked onto mine like a vice. Qin Mufang, this is your flesh and blood, your actual child. Do you truly not care even a single bit? I lifted my head, locking my eyes directly onto hers. Jian Shiji was blessed with a breathtakingly gorgeous top-tier appearance. Her eyes were deep and striking, the bridge of her nose perfectly high and sculpted, and her thin lips were habitually pursed tightly together, exuding an innate aura of cold aristocratic aloofness. But right now, her brow was slightly knitted in a tense frown, and a chaotic storm of complex emotions swirled deep within her eyes. Suddenly, a wave of dark amusement washed over me, making the situation feel utterly ridiculous. Care, I softly echoed her word, acting as though I were genuinely pondering the concept. Then, are you officially deciding right now that you want to keep this baby? The question choked the words right out of her throat, leaving her completely speechless. As a sudden flicker of guilt and hesitation flashed through her eyes, she instantly avoided my piercing gaze, her tone turning stiff and rigid. That's not what I meant at all. It's just that you've changed so drastically lately. Oh, really? I let out a soft chuckle, though the forced smile completely failed to reach my cold eyes. Well, everyone changes eventually, don't they? My cold gaze drifted slowly past her, sweeping over my parents, who were standing just a short distance away, looking absolutely consumed by anxiety, before my eyes locked right back onto her pale face. But all of you haven't changed in the slightest. You're exactly the same as you've always been. Your minds and your hearts are completely consumed by nothing but Qin Huan. Jian Shijie's face instantly drained of all color, and an overwhelming wave of sheer frustration rippled across her features. Her desperate grip on my hand loosened slightly, only to tighten right back up, as her voice subconsciously softened with a hint of a plea. Mufang, please don't be like this. We can always have another baby in the future. I promise you. I burst into a cynical laugh, prying her fingers off my arm one by single one. The surgery is about to begin. Just go on inside. Jian Shijie stared blankly at me, her lips trembling slightly as if to speak. But in the end, she finally turned around and followed the nurse straight into the operating room. The heavy doors slowly sealed shut and the ominous red warning light flickered on. I stood there all alone outside the room, leaning my back against the ice-cold wall as I slowly closed my heavy eyes. The glaring light from the operating room was blindingly sharp, so I slumped down onto the rigid waiting bench and shut my eyes tight. Yet the haunting memories from 5 long years ago began flooding back into my mind completely beyond my control. Back then, my name was still Lin Mufang, and I lived in a dilapidated, crumbling tenement building on the northern edge of the city. My mother slaved away as a nanny for wealthy families, leaving at dawn and returning late at night, her spine growing more bent and broken by the day. My father was a raging alcoholic and a hopeless gambling addict, who would brutally lash out and beat people whenever he got drunk, and would storm back home demanding cash every time he lost money. If he didn't get what he wanted, he would smash everything in sight to pieces. My body was permanently covered in painful dark bruises, and my classmates at school avoided me like the plague. My entire existence was a bleak monochromatic nightmare, with absolutely no light at the end of the tunnel. My sole obsession was to study like a maniac, fantasizing that I would one day ace the college entrance exams, escape this living hell, and never set foot back here again. Until that fateful day arrived, when a group of men dressed in incredibly expensive tailor-made luxury suits showed up, announcing that I had been accidentally swapped at birth with the son of the ultra-wealthy Qin family, and that I, and I alone, was the true legitimate young master of the elite Qin family. On the chaotic day, I was finally brought back to the luxurious Qin mansion. I was clutching a battered canvas backpack that had been washed so many times it was completely faded, with my worn-out sneakers completely caked in thick wet mud. Standing there in that vast cavernous living room that felt large enough to host a horse race, I was utterly paralyzed, not having the slightest clue where to even place my hands or feet. The dirty, muddy footprints I left staining the pristine, expensive carpet instantly drew muffled, condescending snickers from the judgmental servant standing nearby, leaving me so intensely humiliated that I desperately wished the ground would swallow me whole. But right at that agonizing rock bottom moment, an incredibly, breathtakingly gorgeous young woman gracefully walked over to me. She knelt right down gently, taking a wet wipe directly from a servant's hand. And piece by piece, with absolute care and precision, she began wiping away every single speck of mud from my dirty shoes. And then, she pulled out a brand new, incredibly plush pair of soft-soled slippers from the shoe cabinet, placing them delicately right by my feet. Welcome back home. She lifted her gaze, beaming a warm, radiant smile directly at me. Chin Mu Feng. In that exact split second, she looked precisely like a dazzling prince from a fairy tale swooping in to rescue Cinderella, right when I was at my absolute lowest, most pathetic and vulnerable state. She handed me a newfound sense of respect, grace, and human dignity. Later on, I discovered that her name was Jian Shijie, the prestigious future heiress to the massive, ultra-powerful Jian Corporation, and the ultimate dream girl that countless wealthy young socialites fought desperately to pursue. The elite Jian and Qin families had arranged a marriage pact long ago, which meant she had officially become my default fiancé on paper. From that crucial turning point onward, it was Jian Shiji who took me under her wing, guiding me step by painful step to integrate into this bizarre, terrifyingly foreign, and ruthlessly cold high society playground. She meticulously taught me upscale dining etiquette, and personally escorted me to those suffocating, high-stakes elite banquets. Whenever those arrogant trust fund kids tried to subtly mock or look down on me, she would effortlessly and seamlessly step in to shield me and diffuse the tension. Inevitably, I fell completely, utterly, and hopelessly in love with her. I worshipped her as the magnificent, blinding ray of pure sunlight that had suddenly pierced through the absolute pitch-black darkness of my miserable life, my one and only salvation. Until that fateful day arrived when Qin Huan was officially scheduled to be cast out and sent away, and Jian Shijie unexpectedly tracked me down out of nowhere. She was dressed entirely in somber pitch-black clothing that afternoon, her face pale and completely drained of life, while her eyes burned with an overwhelming mix of frantic anxiety and deep, intense desperation that I had never once seen from her before. "Mu Feng," she pleaded, her voice dropping into an incredibly soft, trembling whisper. "Huan, he has been thoroughly pampered and utterly spoiled since the very day he was born. He has never endured a single second of real-world hardship or suffering. If we force him to return to his biological parents' impoverished lifestyle, it will completely shatter him. He won't survive it. So please, just do this one thing for my sake. Could you please find it in your heart to let Huan stay? Can't you just look at him as an extra brother?" It was at that exact soul-crushing moment that reality finally hit me, revealing that all the incredible kindness she had showered upon me, all of her mesmerizing tenderness, and her seemingly endless patience, had been nothing more than a calculated play leading up to this very second, all just to ensure that her precious beloved Qin Huan could seamlessly maintain his luxurious lifestyle within the Qin family mansion, staying right by her side forever. Deep within my soul, something shattered into a million pieces with a loud snap. I fiercely refused. I shut her down immediately, cutting the cord cleanly and without a shred of hesitation. I simply wasn't capable of being that absurdly magnanimous, nor could I ever bring myself to tolerate the spawn of the exact same wicked woman who had stolen my entire life, continuing to hoard and enjoy everything that rightfully belonged to me from day one, sharing my biological parents, and even claiming a stake in the fiancé I had just passionately fallen for. In the end, Qin Huan was officially cast out and sent away. I fully expected Jian Shijie to absolutely despise me and immediately demand that we dissolve our engagement. Yet she did nothing of the sort. Our marriage alliance remained perfectly intact, and she continued to play the role of my official fiancé on paper. However, her attitude toward me gradually deteriorated into an icy mechanical detachment, as if she were merely checking off boxes on a tedious checklist, maintaining nothing more than the bare minimum level of superficial courtesy. Later down the line, I found out through the grapevine that Jian Shiji had desperately tried to break off the engagement, but the powerful elders of the Jian family adamantly refused to permit it, since the true biological heir of the Qin Empire had officially reclaimed his crown. The target of their strategic marriage naturally had to shift directly to me. The terrifying patriarch of the Jian family had even laid down a brutal, explicit ultimatum. If she dared torpedo the alliance over a worthless impostor, the entire family wrath would mercilessly crush Qin Huan and destroy him completely. And so Jian Shijie remained firmly anchored by my side, operating exactly like a thoroughly obedient, soulless puppet on a string. Our wedding plans were constantly stalled, pushed back, and dragged out indefinitely, stretching from the time I was 20 all the way until I turned 25. I silently endured every ounce of the torment, stubbornly clinging to a pathetic, utterly laughable shred of hope. naively believing that time would eventually heal all wounds and change everything. I genuinely thought I could make my biological parents finally embrace and accept me as their true, rightful flesh and blood, and I foolishly believed I could somehow warm up Jian Shijie's frozen heart, a heart that had already been completely claimed by someone else long ago. Until the fateful day we unexpectedly crossed paths at the hospital, where Qin Huan had been rushed after collapsing from sheer exhaustion while working as a food delivery boy, leaving him stranded and helpless in the emergency room. My parents threw themselves onto the bed, violently embracing the frail, utterly devastated Qin Huan, wailing uncontrollably and losing all sense of composure. Then they abruptly whirled around, their eyes bloodshot and tearful, desperately begging me, "Mufeng, please just let Huan come back to us. Just look at the pathetic, miserable life he's been forced to live. He won't try to usurp your position in this family. We swear it, just please let him come back home." I couldn't stop myself from shifting my gaze over to Jian Shijie, who was standing completely frozen right by the edge of the hospital bed, staring at Qin Huan without even blinking a single time. The sheer, unfiltered devotion swirling deep within her eyes was so incredibly intense that it was practically overflowing, a warmth that was 10,000 times greater than anything I had ever received over 5 whole years. At that exact crushing moment, the brutal reality finally forced me to wake up. For 5 agonizing years, I had been acting like a pathetic absolute clown. My parents had never truly purged Qin Huan from their hearts, and Jian Shijie, most of all, never had a single ounce of room for me in her soul. I had lost the game completely and utterly. The very moment I returned home from the hospital that day, I executed exactly 2 things. First, I immediately got in touch with a top-tier law firm to legally draft and officially sign a binding absolute declaration to sever all parental ties, along with a formal agreement to permanently dissolve my engagement. Second, I retained a premium immigration agency to fast-track and expedite my application for permanent residency abroad. All I had to do was bide my time until the end of the month for the final approvals, and I would be able to vanish from this toxic place forever, completely escaping the suffocating people and memories that continuously broke me. I just never anticipated that an unexpected chaotic plot twist would disrupt my final days before departure. But perhaps Jian Shijie getting pregnant and subsequently aborting the child was for the best. It cut the final remaining tie cleanly and thoroughly. Suddenly, I was forcefully jolted awake by an incredibly sharp, agonizing cramp. It felt as though an invisible, ruthless fist was violently crushing my stomach, causing cold sweat to break out across my skin instantly, completely soaking through the entire back of my shirt. I desperately struggled to force myself into a sitting position, clutching my abdomen tightly as the blinding waves of sheer pain caused my vision to fade into darkness. Just as I was about to scream out for assistance, I froze in absolute shock. This was absolutely not my bedroom. The surrounding space was incredibly cramped and claustrophobic, densely cluttered and overflowing with random junk, while the suffocating dusty air choked my lungs. The only source of illumination was a single tiny window positioned high up on the wall, casting a weak, incredibly dim sliver of light into the darkness. It was a storage room. I had been locked away and trapped. "Is anyone out there? Open the door. Open this damn door right now," I screamed, slamming my palms against the heavy wood with every last ounce of my strength. "Open the goddamn door," I screamed, slamming my fist against the wooden panel with every last ounce of my strength. My voice was raspy and completely shredded. "My chronic stomach ulcer is flaring up. The pain is killing me. Open this door." From the other side of the threshold, a faint flurry of approaching footsteps echoed, followed immediately by my biological mother's muffled voice, which sounded shockingly icy detached and utterly foreign through the heavy wooden panel. "Mufeng, stop making a scene and shut your mouth." My father's stern voice chimed in right afterward, dripping with immense disappointment and profound exasperation. "You brought this entirely on yourself by crossing the line so severely. On the surface, you played nice and agreed to let Shijie terminate the pregnancy. But behind our backs, you hired thugs to lock Huan inside a freezing cold storage room. Huan has been extremely traumatized by cold weather ever since he was a literal toddler. Do you have even a single shred of a clue how long he was trapped inside that icy hell? The poor boy almost froze to death in there. Locking you in this storage room for a single day is honestly a massive favor we're granting you, solely out of respect for the fact that you're technically our biological son. Consider this an incredibly lenient slap on the wrist." The horrific accusation hit me like a massive bolt of lightning out of nowhere, instantly turning the blood coursing through my veins into pure ice, locking Qin Huan inside a freezing cold storage room. Me, I did that. I absolutely did not do this. I shrieked at the top of my lungs, pouring every last drop of my strength into the scream, my voice warping into a horrific agonized screech from the piercing stomach pain. I have never ever done something so vile and disgusting in my life. Bring Qin Huan here to confront me face to face. Tell him to get his pathetic ass over here right now. "Big brother," Qin Huan's high-pitched pathetic voice suddenly echoed from right outside, sounding incredibly timid, fragile, and deeply shaken, perfectly calculated to exude a masterful blend of sheer terror and victimhood. Honestly, it's completely fine. I don't hold a grudge. It was just a little bit cold. And I was so terribly frightened, Mom, Dad. Please don't lock Big Brother up like a criminal just because of me. I'm really doing completely okay now. Just look at him. Look at how incredibly pure, kind-hearted, and forgiving Hua An is. My mother's voice exploded with an even more violent wave of self-righteous fury. And then take a good look at your own twisted, venomous, and pure evil soul. Hua An was almost brutally murdered because of your sick, jealous antics. We are simply confining you to this small room for a mere 24 hours without food or water, which is already an act of supreme mercy and tolerance on our part. Yet you still refuse to repent and admit to your sins, denying me food and water for a whole day, and doing it deliberately right when my chronic stomach condition is tearing me apart from the inside out. A dark, cynical laugh almost forced its way out of my throat. This entire situation was so utterly farcical and insane. It was so profoundly absurd that I instantly lost the willpower to even try and argue my innocence. The suffocating panic of my severe claustrophobia began to aggressively trigger and claw at my chest, as the pitch-black darkness enveloped me like a heavy, suffocating tidal wave, creeping and surging in from every single direction, brutally crushing my chest and compressing my lungs. Breathing became an increasingly desperate, near impossible struggle, as the violent stabbing spasms in my stomach intensified with each passing second. I desperately tried to hold myself together, my teeth chattering uncontrollably from the agony. Mom, Dad, I have severe claustrophobia. I can't survive in a locked space like this for long. And my stomach ulcer is tearing me apart right now. Please just open the door and let me out. Take me to the hospital. I am begging you. Cut the crap and stop lying through your teeth. My father's voice cut me off, dripping with absolute disgust and impatience. What absolute nonsense about claustrophobia. What fake stomach ache. You're just fabricating pathetic medical excuses to play the victim and milk our sympathy. We are absolutely not falling for your manipulative mind games ever again. Sit tight in there and reflect deeply on your heinous sins. My heart slowly, steadily plummeted, sinking deep into a frozen pitch-black abyss of total despair. I forced myself to stop staring at that tightly sealed, unyielding door, and turned my gaze in another direction. Deep down, I knew with absolute certainty that Jian Shijie was also standing right outside. Jian Shijie! My voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, clutching onto the absolute final microscopic shred of hope left in my soul. Can you just trust me for once in your life? Just please believe me. Just this one single time, if I truly harbored such malicious intent to destroy Qin Huan. Then back then, why on earth would I have agreed so effortlessly to let him move back into the mansion? And why would I have consented so cleanly to letting you abort our baby? A suffocating silence blanketed the hallway for a few excruciating seconds, before Jian Shijie's trademark icy elite tone pierced through the thick wood. Mufeng, if you cross the line and commit a crime, you have to man up and face the consequences. It's merely a single day. Just grit your teeth, endure it, and it'll be over before you know it. Take this time to learn a valuable lesson for your own good. An ice-cold wave of pure despair crept up from the soles of my feet like venomous thorns, wrapping tightly around my bleeding heart loop after loop, constricting tighter and tighter until I could barely breathe. I am such a pathetic, delusional fucking clown. How could I have completely forgotten Jian Shijie's heart belongs entirely to Qin Huan? From the absolute beginning to the very end, that fact has never changed. I spent 5 whole agonizing years of my life trying. Yet I completely failed to melt a single millimeter of her frozen stone-cold heart. How could I possibly be stupid enough to expect that when forced to choose between me and Qin Huan? She would actually take my side and believe me, even for just a single split second. The sound of their footsteps gradually faded away into the distance. No matter how violently I pounded on the wood or how hoarsely I screamed for help, the silence outside remained absolute, offering not a single trace of an echo. A brutal cocktail of physical and emotional agony heavily intertwined, mercilessly torturing my body as I lay curled up like a dog on the freezing, filthy floor. My vision of the suffocating locked room began to blur and fade away, as the terrifying onset of severe claustrophobic panic gripped me like an invisible demonic hand, viciously choking the absolute life right out of my throat. Breathing became an increasingly impossible, agonizing struggle, until the world finally went pitch black and I completely lost consciousness. When I finally drifted back to reality, I was greeted by the familiar, pungent stench of hospital disinfectant. My entire body was still radiating with intense throbbing pain, but at the very least, I was no longer trapped in that suffocating, hopeless abyss of darkness. A nurse was actively adjusting my IV drip line, and the moment she noticed my eyes fluttering open, she spoke in a cold, robotic tone. "Oh, you're finally awake. Your chronic stomach ulcer suffered a severe post-surgery infection and internal bleeding. You'll need to be hospitalized for a few days for close continuous observation. Hospital policy requires a family member to accompany and sign off on you. Where are your next of kin? Give them a call and tell them to get over here immediately." I painfully forced my dry, severely cracked lips to part, my voice sounding raw and completely shredded. "I don't have any family left. Just hire a premium private caregiver to watch over me instead. Get me the absolute best one available, and I'll cover the entire bill myself. The very second the words left my mouth, the heavy door to the hospital room was abruptly pushed wide open, and Jian Shijie stepped inside. She was tightly clutching a thermal food container in her hand, her face masked with a noticeable layer of deep exhaustion, though it did absolutely nothing to dull her stunning elite elegance. The moment my words registered in her ears, her brow instantly knitted together into a sharp displeased frown. What on earth do you mean by saying you don't have any family? Am I not standing right here in front of you? She marched over to the bedside, setting the thermal flask down on the nightstand, her tone heavily laced with a forced, deliberate gentleness. Mufeng, you were the one who crossed the line first by executing such a horrific, malicious stunt against Hua An. Your parents and I were simply driven to absolute madness by your reckless actions. But now you've officially served your punishment. So can we please just bury the hatchet and let this whole thing go? Stop acting like a petulant child throwing a tantrum. She paused for a brief moment, intentionally dropping her voice into an even softer, more comforting pitch. For the upcoming week, I have already cleared my entire schedule and put all major corporate matters on hold, solely so I can stay right here by your side to personally nurse you back to health. I just stared blankly up at her, quietly observing the forced artificial warmth in her calculated gaze, and listening to the hollow words that superficiality tried to paint as deeply affectionate. Yet deep inside my soul, there was only a vast, desolately barren numbness, resembling a plot of hard, completely frozen earth that could no longer trigger even the slightest ripple of emotion. Just as I was about to part my lips to tell her to get lost, my phone resting on the nightstand abruptly began to vibrate and ring. It was an incoming video call directly from my biological mother. I systematically swiped the screen to answer it, and the smiling faces of my parents and Qin Huan immediately flooded the display. The dynamic background behind them featured a stunning sun-drenched tropical beach, complete with crystalline turquoise waters and a cloudless blue sky. Qin Huan was thoroughly coddled and snuggled up right between my parents, beaming with an expression of absolute smug contentment. My mother's voice filtered through the speaker, carrying a microscopic, barely noticeable trace of superficial guilt, but heavily dominated by a tone of total entitlement. Mufeng, so you're finally awake. Listen, Huan suffered such a horrific trauma from your stunt, and his emotional state has been completely shattered ever since. Because of that, we've flown him out to the Maldives to help him decompress and heal, so we won't be able to make it to the hospital to nurse you back to health. But you have to understand the malicious stunt you pulled last time was genuinely a bit too psychotic and uncalled for. Consider our absence as a small mandatory token of compensation to make it up to Huan, so please don't hold a petty grudge against us, alright? I stared blankly at the three of them displayed on the screen, looking like a picture-perfect, deeply loving family of three, leaving the space where my heart used to be, feeling completely hollowed out, to the point where I couldn't even register the concept of pain anymore. I simply offered a single deadpan response. Understood. My mother clearly never anticipated that I would remain this hauntingly composed, freezing in utter shock for a moment as she struggled to formulate more words, before awkwardly shifting the topic. By the way, is Shiji currently there by your hospital bed right now? Pass the phone over to her. Let me speak with her for a brief second. I casually handed the vibrating device over to Jian Shiji, standing beside me. Jian Shiji took the phone and immediately paced over to the far side of the window, making it impossible for me to decode the exact specifics of their conversation, though fragmented snippets like Huan, he desperately wishes you were here too, Huan. His mental stability is still incredibly fragile, and Huan claims he needs to see you right now, continuously drifted over. I watched a heavy wave of visible hesitation ripple across Jian Shijie's side profile, yet deep within the absolute recesses of her eyes, there was a blinding, unmistakable flash of intense worry and burning desire to leave. The corner of my mouth twitched into a cynical, hollow smirk the moment Jian Shijie disconnected the call and slowly walked back to the edge of my bed. Her face was completely masked with an awkward, conflicted expression of wanting to speak. I decided to beat her to the punch and spoke up first, my voice entirely flat and deadpan. Go ahead and fly out to be with Qin Huan. I can easily hire a professional private caregiver to manage everything here. Jian Shijie froze entirely in sheer disbelief, looking as though she couldn't process a single word. I said you should go to the Maldives and accompany Qin Huan to clear his head. I absolutely don't need you here. Jian Shijie's entire face instantly darkened, as a violent wave of intense frustration and severe discomfort visibly and completely overwhelmed her emotional composure. Qin Mufeng, what the hell is actually wrong with you lately? You keep constantly pushing me away and throwing me directly toward Huan. I didn't bother offering a real explanation, merely asking her flatly once again, so, are you going or not? Jian Shijie froze entirely on the spot, tightly pursing her thin lips in absolute silence for several painful seconds, before ultimately blurting out in a stiff, defensive tone, Huan's. mental state is completely volatile and unstable right now. Plus, he suffered such a massive trauma from your stunt this time around. So I genuinely should go out there and keep a close protective eye on him. Consider it my way of making up for the horrific damage you caused. I offered a slow nod. Go right ahead, then make sure you compensate him thoroughly. Jian Shijie was utterly triggered by my completely dismissive feather-light tone, causing her temper to flare up instantly. She felt with absolute certainty that my words carried a hidden biting malice, dripping with passive-aggressive sarcasm. A suffocating wave of unprovoked raging fury boiled deep inside her chest, and that terrifying sensation of losing total control over me reached its absolute peak. Yet in the end, she couldn't bring herself to say another word, abruptly turning around and storming out of the hospital room with massive strides. The heavy wooden door was violently slammed shut behind her, echoing through the room with a sharp thudding crash. I shut my heavy eyes, taking a deep, stabilizing breath before slowly exhaling the tension. This is for the best. Over the next week, I peacefully recovered from my injuries in the hospital, while Qin Huan's gloating WeChat messages and showy photos bombarded my phone like a relentless winter blizzard. Some photos featured my parents tightly flanking him on both sides, beaming with radiant, carefree smiles against the backdrop of the ocean. Other times, it was a candid shot of him holding a sun umbrella over Jian Shijie on the sandy beach, with Jian Shijie staring back at his side profile with an incredibly tender, melting gaze. There were even photos of Jian Shijie rocking a brand new expensive swimsuit, showcasing her slender, breathtaking silhouette from behind. The accompanying captions were identically patterned with petty bragging and blatant provocation. Hey, big bro, look at this. Mom and dad still clearly love and pamper me the most. Shiji says the sunset over here is absolutely breathtaking. It's such a massive shame that you're stuck in a bed and can't see it, bro. I graciously handed you 5 whole years to cement your place, but you were still too damn pathetic and incompetent to capture a single person's heart. Since you're such a useless bottom-tier loser, I'm officially reclaiming every single luxury that rightfully belongs to me. I quietly scrolled through those meticulously staged, strategically angled photographs, and the toxic blocks of text dripping with pure, unadulterated malice, my expression remaining flawlessly serene and detached, acting precisely as though I were merely browsing the social media feed of a complete and total stranger. In the end, I lazily tapped open my direct chat history with Qin Huan, and offered nothing but a single unbothered K as a response. Right after that, I completely powered down my phone, switching it onto absolute silent mode. The weather was absolutely spectacular on the afternoon of my discharge. I smoothly processed all of my medical release paperwork completely on my own, and cruised my car slowly back toward the luxurious Qin family estate. Just as my vehicle rolled onto the tree-lined boulevard leading directly to the mansion gates, a shadowy silhouette abruptly materialized from the dense roadside bushes and violently flung himself forward, throwing his body straight into the trajectory of my front bumper. I slammed my foot ruthlessly onto the brake pedal, viciously wrenching the steering wheel to the side. But the front end of the car still inevitably and violently clipped the incoming figure with a sharp thud. The individual instantly went limp, collapsing heavily onto the asphalt. It was Qin Huan. My heart completely skipped a beat in sheer shock for a split second, and I immediately unbuckled my seatbelt, sprinting out of the car to inspect the damage. Qin Huan lay completely sprawled out across the pavement, his temples severely scraped and oozing fresh streaks of blood against his ghostly pale skin. His eyes sealed shut, though his chest was still shallowly rising and falling. I systematically dialed emergency services and immediately notified the police. The ambulance and a squad car arrived on the scene almost simultaneously, and as the driver directly involved in the crash, I was required to cooperate with the investigation. I rode along inside the emergency vehicle all the way back to the hospital. I hadn't been waiting outside the operating room for long before Jian Shijie and my biological parents came frantically scrambling down the hallway. Their faces were completely masked with overwhelming panic and suffocating dread, to the point where they didn't even bother casting a single glance at me standing right beside them. Rushing directly to the double doors of the surgical unit, and violently grabbing a nurse who happened to be stepping out. They shrieked hysterically, "How is my son? Is he going to survive?" The poor nurse was thoroughly startled and visibly shaken by their unhinged behavior. "He is currently still undergoing surgery. You'll have to wait until the lead surgeon comes out to get the exact specifics." Jian Shijie began pacing back and forth across the floor like a manic, anxious wreck, while my parents desperately clung to one another for physical support, their eyes completely bloodshot and filled with tears. I merely stood there in absolute silence, melting into the dark shadows of the corridor, watching them rip themselves apart with agonizing worry over Qin Huan's well-being. Yet that vast expanse of barren, frozen wasteland deep inside my soul didn't even suffer the most microscopic fracture of emotion. The blinding red warning light above the operating theater finally flickered off. The lead surgeon slowly stepped out into the hallway, and Jian Shijie, along with my parents, instantly swarmed him like vultures. "Doctor, please tell us, how is our son Xios?" The physician systematically peeled off his surgical mask, letting out a heavy sigh of relief, The operation was an absolute flawless success. The patient's life is absolutely out of immediate danger, and he will regain consciousness once the anesthesia completely wears off. The laceration on his temple has been seamlessly stitched up. Just be incredibly vigilant to avoid any potential infection, and ensuring he gets plenty of bed rest will suffice. The trio barely managed to catch their breath in relief before hearing the physician continue in a serious tone. However, while conducting a comprehensive full-body scan on the patient, we discovered an alarming number of both fresh and faded old contusions completely covering his body, along with extensive soft tissue damage. Frankly, these severe injuries don't align with the standard car accident trauma. They point heavily toward a prolonged, brutal physical assault. As for the exact circumstances behind this violence, it is probably something that you as his next of kin desperately need to investigate thoroughly. Jen Shiji and my biological parents instantly turned ghostly pale. And at that precise moment, seeing that Qin Huan was totally fine and out of the woods, I quietly spun on my heel preparing to walk away. Qin Mufanga. Jan Shiji finally bothered to register my presence, viciously clamping her hand down around my wrist, with an incredibly intense crushing grip. Her voice cut through me like ice. You brutally plow your car into Huan, leaving him in this pathetic state. And you expect to just slip away without offering a single word of explanation. I halted my steps, but just as I parted my lips to speak, Qin Huan's fragile, raspy whimper echoed from inside the recovery unit. Sheji, Dad, Mom. The three of them instantly abandoned me without a second thought, storming into the room. I remained anchored right outside the doorway, peering through the glass panel to see Qin Huan's head heavily wrapped in pristine white gauze, his face looking profoundly pale and pathetic, as my parents and Jan Shijie completely swarmed his bedside, showering him with soft coddling whispers of reassurance. Through the door crack, my parents' incredibly cautious, tiptoeing voices floated out. Huan, please tell us what on earth actually happened to you. All those horrific marks on your body. Qin Huan cast a highly calculated, terrified glance toward me standing at the door, hesitating purposefully as if choking back a massive secret. He whispered in a tiny, trembling voice, It's honestly nothing. I was just incredibly clumsy and careless, entirely on my own. Huan, I need you to stop lying and tell me the absolute truth right now. Jen Shijie demanded, marching right up to the edge of the mattress, her authoritative tone heavy with intense, suffocating pressure. Where the hell did those brutal bruises all over your skin come from? Under her intense, unrelenting cross-examination, Qin Huan looked as though he finally crumbled under the overwhelming psychological weight, sobbing out in a fragmented, weeping voice, It was Big Brother. When all of you flew me out to the Maldives to clear my head, Big Brother became absolutely furious after seeing the social media photos I posted. He spent every single day bombarding my WeChat with horrific abuse and threats. The things he said to me were absolutely horrific and vile. The second I got back, I desperately wanted to track him down and explain everything. But I never expected him to hire a vicious gang of thugs to completely corner and trap me inside a dark alleyway, brutally beating me to a pulp. His tone dripped with agonizing sorrow. I knew Big Brother was being discharged from the hospital today, so I just wanted to come home and have a peaceful heart-to-heart talk with him. I wanted to reassure him and make him realize that I truly have absolutely zero desire or intention to usurp a single thing that belongs to him. The moment I arrived at the mansion gates, I heard the roar of an engine, and knowing it was him returning home, I excitedly ran out onto the road to welcome him back. But I never expected that the very second he locked eyes with me, he would deliberately accelerate and plow his car straight into my body. As he reached the climax of his theatrical monologue, he completely broke down, sobbing hysterically. Qin Mufeng's father instantly flew into a demonic, unhinged rage, storming out of the recovery unit like a madman, viciously thrusting his finger directly into my face, his entire frame vibrating with pure, unadulterated fury. You vile, ungrateful monster! What the hell did Huan ever do to deserve such malicious cruelty from you? He merely shares a microscopic sliver of our parental attention, and a tiny fraction of Shiji's affection and care. Literally everything else in this empire is handed to you on a silver platter. Why on earth can you simply not tolerate his existence? Are you truly so thoroughly evil that you won't rest until you've brutally murdered him? My mother also staggered out of the room, tears streaming down her face, staring at me with an expression of profound, crushing disappointment and heartbreak. Mufeng, how could you possibly degrade into such a demonic, unrecognizable creature? We genuinely always assumed you were just a bit spoiled and throwing a tantrum, or perhaps slightly envious and jealous of Huan. We never expected your soul to be this ruthlessly venomous and cruel. Jen Shijie stood tall right behind them, locking her eyes onto mine, her gaze radiating an absolute chilling frostbite, filled with intense disgust, a smug sense of validation, along with a subtle, barely noticeable layer of pure exhaustion. I silently observed this spectacular multi-award-winning theatrical performance with dead eyes, staring blankly at their distorted, rage-filled faces, as the absolute final ripple of numbness completely flattened out inside my cold heart. And so, I finally parted my lips, my voice sounding so hauntingly serene it was terrifying. How exactly are you planning to punish me on his behalf this time around? Just hurry up and get it over with. I still need to head back home to get some sleep. This display of absolute total indifference, underscored by a flippant, rushing attitude, completely exploded the fuses of every single person in that hallway. A violently loud echoing slap slammed ruthlessly across my face with maximum force. It was my father. His face was completely livid and contorted with blinding rage. Yet the exact second after delivering the blow, he froze entirely in shock. As a sudden flicker of regret and utter panic flashed across the deep recesses of his eyes, my head remained fiercely tilted to the side from the impact, the skin on my cheek rapidly swelling up into a bright, angry crimson contour that throbbed with a burning, white-hot, agonizing sensation. The metallic, bitter taste of fresh blood slowly pooled inside my mouth. I systematically, agonizingly turned my head back to face him, using the absolute back of my hand to coldly wipe the blood from the corner of my lips, locking eyes with my father. My gaze remained eerily, profoundly serene throughout the ordeal, even carrying a subtle deadpan hint of inquiry. So that's the grand finale of your physical punishment, right? In that case, am I officially allowed to turn around and leave now? My father was so thoroughly choked with absolute rage that he couldn't formulate a single syllable. Jian Shijie aggressively stepped forward, her chest heaving up and down in a violent, unhinged rhythm, completely losing her typical corporate composure, fully triggered by my sheer apathy. She stared directly at my heavily swollen, bruised cheek and those hauntingly calm, deadpan eyes of mine, causing a sinister wave of unbridled fury to explode straight into her brain. Completely abandoning all rationality, she spat out venomously, "You want to talk about punishment, Qin Mufeng Hua'an? Literally has a grand total of 108 distinct horrific trauma scars all over his body. Since you had the audacity to execute such a brutal assault, you better have the damn balls to face the music. Not a single matching injury on your own pathetic flesh will be spared." She raised her voice authoritatively, instantly summoning the elite personal bodyguards who had been maintaining a perimeter nearby. "Get over here right now, drag this piece of trash down to the main entrance of the hospital and start throwing money around. Announce to every single pedestrian passing by that a single strike to his face nets them a cool 50,000 cash. Keep this brutal circus going until the exact count is fully satisfied." The very millisecond those unhinged words left her lips, even my highly biased, cold-blooded parents were frozen in absolute paralyzed shock, staring at Jian Shijie with an expression of pure unadulterated disbelief. I abruptly snapped my head up, locking my gaze entirely onto Jian Shijie's face. Yet within the reflection of my pupils, there wasn't a single microscopic trace of fear. Nor was there the slightest hint of a pathetic beg for mercy. There was only a completely dead, chillingly desolated wasteland of pure apathy. That specific look resembled a razor-sharp Sub-Zero ice dagger, brutally and unexpectedly plunging straight into the deepest center of Jian Shijie's heart. Her chest violently convulsed with a sudden suffocating spasm, as an overwhelming wave of profound suffocating regret and sheer terror instantly paralyzed her entire nervous system. What in the absolute hell was she doing? She pivotally, almost immediately walked back her horrific decree, her elite voice laced with a subtle, barely perceptible tremor. "However, as long as you are willing to formally admit your heinous crimes right now, drop down on your knees to beg Hua'an for forgiveness, and swear a blood oath that you will never lay a hand on him again, I can easily choose to completely nullify the orders I just barked out." I simply maintained a heavy dead silence, staring blankly through her for a few excruciating seconds, before contorting the corner of my lips into an incredibly mocking, venomous sneer. I didn't utter a single solitary word, yet that absolute suffocating silence proved to be infinitely more lethal than any weaponized razor-sharp insult, driving Jian Shijie into an even more unhinged, explosive state of raw fury. With a single glance, she could read that I was totally unrepentant, choosing to double down to the bitter end. And the absolute final shred of psychological panic and lingering pity inside her instantly evaporated. Conquering her guilt, she erupted into a state of sheer, humiliated rage, frenziedly waving her hand at the personal guards while barking, "What the hell are you still freezing for? Drag this piece of garbage down right now, Yolga." Two massive burly bodyguards immediately stepped forward, brutally flanking and pinning me from both sides. I didn't offer a single microscopic shred of physical resistance, completely allowing them to drag my limp body across the floor and out toward the exit. The very moment they hauled me past the open door of the recovery unit, I caught a clear glimpse of my biological parents already nestled right back at Qin Hua'an's bedside, showering him with intensely coddling, sympathetic comfort, acting precisely as though the horrific circus unfolding out in the hallway had absolutely nothing to do with them. A low, hollow chuckle suddenly rumbled from the depths of my throat as I began to laugh out loud. The sound was incredibly faint and airy, yet it vibrated with an endless abyss of soul-crushing desolation and biting, cynical mockery. A lone scorching tear tracked its way down my severely swollen, throbbing cheek. I was ruthlessly dragged all the way down to the main entrance of the hospital and dumped directly into the center of the most heavily congested high-traffic concrete courtyard. True to their unhinged orders, the bodyguards literally began to shower the entire area with cold, hard cash. Thick, brick-sized bundles of crisp, brand-new $100 bills were carelessly thrown and scattered across the filthy pavement, instantly triggering a massive wave of shock and a chaotic frenzy among the gathering pedestrians. Physically assault this absolute piece of trash just once and you'll walk away with 50 grand in cold hard cash on the spot. The lead bodyguard bellowed at the top of his lungs. Initially, the swelling crowd merely formed a tight perimeter gawking at the scene and whispering in hushed, judgmental murmurs, as not a single soul harbored the guts to actually step across the line. That was until a raggedly dressed, sketchy-looking man, with absolute unadulterated greed radiating from his eyes, aggressively broke through the crowd, experimentally delivering a violent testing shove to my chest. The exact microsecond he was actually handed a thick, heavy stack of crisp banknotes straight from the bodyguard's hands. The surrounding mob completely lost their minds, hitting an absolute boiling point. Holy shit, they are actually handing out the cash for real. Just one single strike scores you a free 50 grand. Oh. Move the hell out of the way, let me get a piece of him. The human mob surged forward like a violent, unstoppable tidal wave. A relentless storm of heavy fists, brutal kicks, blinding slaps, and violent shoving rained down like a catastrophic hurricane upon my fragile, battered frame. I was brutally knocked flat onto the concrete, immediately forcing my body to curl into a tight, pathetic fetal position, desperately shielding my head and face. Agonizing waves of pure white-hot pain assaulted me from every single conceivable direction, making it feel as though my very bones were being violently crushed into fine powder, and my internal organs were being utterly ruptured and torn apart from the sheer impact. A deafening high-pitched ringing echoed inside my eardrums, drowning out everything except the unhinged, feral roars of the greedy crowd, and the crisp, fluttering rustle of banknotes flying wildly through the air. My consciousness slowly began to blur and fade away, as a thick crimson curtain of blood completely blanketed my vision. The chaotic world around me finally fell into absolute blissful silence. When I eventually drifted back to the waking world, I found myself lying inside the hospital's most luxurious, high-end VIP medical suite. Every single microscopic inch of my skeleton was screaming in absolute unadulterated agony. My entire battered frame was heavily mummified in thick layers of medical gauze. The atmosphere inside the VIP suite was dead silent, save for the repetitive, rhythmic, mechanical bleeping of the vital monitors. I painfully attempted to twitch my stiff fingertips and hit the call buttons on the nightstand, waiting for what felt like an absolute eternity. So long that I was right on the precipice of slipping back into unconsciousness, before a nurse finally kicked the door open, her face masked with pure irritation. "What the hell do you want now?" I managed to rasp out that my throat was completely parched and burning like wildfire. The nurse aggressively rolled her eyes at me, poured a glass of freezing tap water, and slammed it violently down on the nightstand. A good portion of the liquid splashed over the edges. "Drink up and quit slamming that damn button. We are swamped out there." The second the words left her mouth, she spun on her heel and stormed out. I stared blankly at that lone glass of water, and then redirected my gaze toward the tightly shut, unyielding wooden door, as a wave of absolute crystal-clear realization washed over my soul. This medical facility belonged entirely to the elite Jian corporate empire. Since Jian Shijie had publicly humiliated and treated me like absolute garbage, then even if I legally remained her official fiancé on paper, and even if I occupied their most expensive VIP suite, the low-tier staff were obviously never going to grant me even a microscopic shred of human decency. I lay there in absolute deadpan silence, quietly enduring the dual torture of throbbing physical pain and agonizing dehydration. Over the next several days, this horrific neglect became my absolute baseline reality. The meals delivered to my room were consistently stone cold and practically inedible, and my bandage changes were executed with brutal calculated roughness. Out of every 10 times I frantically hit that emergency call button, 8 went entirely ignored. On the rare occasions, a group of nurses actually bothered to step inside. They would crowd together in a tight circle, gossiping and whispering in voices that were deliberately loud enough for me to hear perfectly. "Hey, did you hear room 302? Next door is occupied by the adopted master of the Chin family. Oh my god, he is absolutely gorgeous and so incredibly sweet. Right, CEO Jian is literally staying by his bedside, 24/7, never leaving him for a second. She is completely obsessed and head over heels for him. We need to make absolutely sure we roll out the absolute red carpet treatment for him. Who knows if CEO Jian is thrilled with our VIP care. We might all score massive corporate promotions and fat raises. Seriously, unlike this pathetic loser who dug his own grave. CEO Jian clearly despises his entire existence now. So who the hell does he think he is, still putting on aristocratic airs? I listened to every single toxic word, my face remaining completely blank and devoid of emotion. Later that afternoon, a nurse sauntered in to change my medical dressings. her movements completely sloppy, lazy, and careless. The exact microsecond she finished, she aggressively spun her heavy medical cart toward the exit, and the metal wheel violently snagged onto my IV line, which was loosely hanging off the edge of the mattress, delivering a brutal sudden yank. The metal needle was ruthlessly ripped straight out of my vein, and a heavy bubble of crimson blood instantly erupted across the back of my hand. A sharp blinding bolt of electrical pain radiated through my skin, and given how thoroughly depleted and fragile my body already was, this completely unexpected violent jerk completely shattered my center of gravity, causing my entire body to helplessly roll right off the edge of the high mattress, crashing heavily and brutally onto the cold, unyielding floor. An agonizing, soul-crushing wave of torture erupted directly from my already fractured ribs. My vision went entirely black for a terrifying second, bringing me right to the absolute precipice of losing consciousness once again. The two careless nurses were visibly startled by the loud crash, glancing back over their shoulders at me. Yet, instead of rushing over to physically assist me off the floor, they actually bitched at me in an irritated whine. Ugh, what the hell is wrong with you? Can't you pay closer attention and be a little more careful? We are in a massive rush to deliver gourmet desserts to young Master Chin right now. If you mess up our schedule and delay us, are you going to take the blame? The moment that toxic trash left their mouths, they aggressively pushed their cart and stormed out without a single backward glance. I lay completely pinned flat against the hard floor, the excruciating agony radiating from my ribcage, making it practically impossible to even draw a single breath. I desperately attempted to haul myself up multiple times, but my shattered body refused to move. Right at that exact microsecond, the heavy door to the VIP suite was violently pushed open, and Jian Shijie stepped across the threshold. Her eyes locked instantly onto my crumpled, pathetic form sprawled across the concrete, and her facial expression completely shifted into one of total shock. She covered the distance in massive strides, throwing herself down beside me. Mufeng, what on earth happened to you? She carefully, with immense trepidation, began to hoist my fragile frame up. And the exact second she noticed the dark pool of blood oozing from my hand and my face contorted in agony, she frantically slammed the emergency call button to summon the medical staff, before turning around to unleash a thunderous, rage-filled roar at the two incompetent nurses who had just reached the threshold, and hadn't even had the opportunity to completely disappear down the hallway. Explain yourselves right the hell now. Is this how you lazy pieces of garbage execute premium patient care in my facility? The two nurses turned completely ghostly pale, trembling violently in sheer terror. As I was forced to lean heavily against her chest, I could instantly inhale the aggressive, suffocating aroma of expensive winter plum blossom perfume radiating from her skin, a specific luxury fragrance that belonged exclusively to Qin Huan. I opened my lips and spoke with an absolute deadpan composure, my voice profoundly weak yet hauntingly crystal clear. It's honestly nothing. They just accidentally snagged my line, and I had a little fall, that's all. Jian Shijie's entire body went completely rigid on the spot, her head snapping down to stare directly into my dead eyes. There wasn't a single microscopic trace of self-pity, resentment, or a desire to file a complaint on my face. I was merely stating the objective reality as if it concerned a complete stranger. That invisible emotional thorn buried deep inside her chest brutally gouged her soul once again. She turned back to the trembling medical staff, barking out in an icy, authoritative tone. The two of you will march directly to the finance department this very second to collect your final pay, and then get the absolute fuck out of my hospital forever. Furthermore, issue an absolute mandate to the head nurse to conduct a scorched earth audit of the entire VIP wing. If even a single microscopic incident of this nature ever repeats itself, I will personally fire every single one of you ungrateful bastards. You know, the humiliated nurses burst into tears and ran down the hallway. A medical team rushed in shortly after to clean and restitch the bloody gash on the back of my hand, carefully re-examining my fractured ribcage. Miraculously, there was no secondary fracture from the impact. Once the medical personnel cleared out, the luxury suite fell into a dead silence, leaving just the two of us. Jian Shijie sat down silently at the edge of the mattress, staring directly at my pale, severely emaciated face, her eyes swirling with a profoundly complex emotional storm. She slowly extended her hand, seemingly wanting to gently trace my bruised cheek, but froze mid-air, unable to bring herself to make contact. Ultimately, she just reached down and awkwardly tucked the blanket around my shoulders. Have these useless scumbags been actively mistreating and neglecting you over the past few days? Her voice sounded noticeably raspy and strained. Why the hell didn't you just tell me? I was literally in the adjacent suite staying by Huan's side, which caused me to neglect you, but you easily could have come over to find me. I closed my heavy eyelids, offering a flat response. There was no need. What the hell do you mean by saying there was no need? Jian Shijie was instantly triggered by my cold apathy, a surge of irritation boiling up before she suppressed it. I am your legal fiancé, for God's sake. If you suffer any injustice or abuse, you can always bring it directly to me. Are you seriously still holding a petty grudge over what happened last time? Are you still deeply resentful about that incident outside the hospital gates? That specific time, I admit I was completely blinded by sheer rage. I definitely shouldn't have taken things that far, but you genuinely shouldn't have launched that psychotic attack on Hwaan either, Jian Shijie. I coldly cut her off mid-sentence, snapping my eyes open, to lock a completely dead, emotionless gaze onto her face. Are you officially finished speaking? I'm completely done talking and I need you to leave so I can finally get some rest. Thank you for pulling me off the floor. The second the words left my mouth, I gently brushed away her hand, which was still resting on my blanket, slowly shifted my body over, and completely turned my back toward her. Jian Shijie stared blankly at my rigid turned spine, as that exact same suffocating wave of intense frustration and severe panic ruthlessly swept through her entire nervous system once again. She parted her lips, desperately wanting to formulate some sort of defense. Yet she found herself completely incapable of uttering a single syllable. Right at that precise second, her smartphone began to vibrate and ring loudly. It was an incoming call from none other than Qin Hwaan. Shiji, where on earth did you go? My surgical stitches are suddenly throbbing with unbearable pain again. Yes. Jian Shijie cast a lingering, conflicted glance at my turned back, as I feigned being completely dead to the world in a deep slumber. Ultimately, she still pushed herself up from the bedside, muttering in a low, guilty whisper, make sure you get some proper rest. I will come back to check on you a bit later. With that, she spun around and walked out of the suite with rapid, hurried steps, over the course of the next several days. Jian Shijie actually made it a habit to swing by lingering in my room for half a day, awkwardly and clumsily attempting to nurse me back to health, desperately trying to spark a conversation with me, and even pitching the grand idea that once I finally got discharged, she would whisk me away to Northern Europe, a dream trip I had casually mentioned ages ago, just to chase the northern lights together, or stay at one of those ancient scenic towns I used to adore for a while. Yet, every single time I merely shut her down with the flat cold, no need. I completely lost interest in all of that. So just go focus on your own business. My overarching vibe remained utterly unwavering, hauntingly serene, entirely detached, behaving precisely as if I were dealing with a completely irrelevant stranger. Finally, the absolute breaking point arrived when Jian Shijie yet again pushed the idea of flying me out to France just to clear my head, only to be shot down instantly under my usual pretext of being too exhausted. She completely snapped, unable to bottle up her emotions for another second. Qin Mufeng, she abruptly bolted up from her seat, looming directly over my bed, glaring down at me, with an intense cocktail of burning rage and sheer bewilderment swirling in her eyes. What in the absolute hell do you actually want from me at this point? I already swallowed my pride and apologized. I threw massive amounts of compensation and resources your way. I'm even keeping you company right here day in and day out, sacrificing my own time. What else do I possibly have to do to satisfy you? Just spit it out already, Og. The entire medical suite fell dead silent, save for the heavy, erratic sound of her breathing. I systematically, agonizingly lifted my gaze, staring directly at her flawless face, which had grown incredibly sharp, tense, and hostile from the overwhelming fury coursing through her. I locked eyes with her for an excruciatingly long time. And then, I clearly and deliberately enunciated every single syllable, I want you to get the hell out. Jian Shiji froze entirely in her tracks, looking totally dumbfounded as if her brain couldn't process the words. I said I want you to pack up and get the absolute fuck out of my hospital room, permanently vanish from my field of vision, and never show your pathetic face in front of me for the rest of your life. The words hit Jian Shijie like a catastrophic lightning strike, making her stare back at me with wide, horrified, unbelieving eyes, her chest heaving up and down violently, as her complexion instantly drained of color, turning absolutely hideous. Qin Mufeng, do you have any coherent idea what kind of absolute nonsense you are spouting right now? My expression remained entirely deadpan, completely unbothered. And just as I parted my lips to double down on my statement, right at that exact microsecond, the heavy door to my VIP suite was violently slammed open from the outside. My biological father and mother, flanked by a hysterically weeping Qin Hwaan, burst into the room. Shiji, oh my god, something catastrophic has happened. Hwaan is in absolute catastrophic trouble. My biological mother shrieked hysterically through a flood of tears. Jian Shiji desperately suppressed the raging storm of emotional shock brewing inside her chest, swiftly pivoting toward them as she barked, "What on earth happened? Slow down and talk." My father was frantically sweating bullets from pure panic. Hwaan, he went out to an exclusive club with some friends to have a few drinks tonight, and things totally spiraled out of control. He got into a violent altercation with someone and accidentally shattered a bottle over the guy's skull, completely splitting his head open. Now the cops have swarmed the place, and they are strictly demanding to drag him straight to the precinct. Qin Hwaan was cowering like a pathetic spineless dog directly behind our mother, his entire body trembling violently with absolute terror. Shiji, I swear to God, I didn't mean to do it. I am completely terrified out of my mind right now. Please don't let them throw me into a jail cell. So, the exact moment Jian Shijie processed the horrific breakdown, Her brow furrowed into an incredibly tight, deeply frustrated scowl, though she still managed to maintain a relatively calm and authoritative demeanor. How severe are the victim's injuries? If it's merely a minor laceration, we can easily bypass the courts through a private settlement, throwing money at them alongside a formal apology. However, standard police protocol dictates they must bring him in to log an official statement, meaning he might legally have to be detained in a holding cell for a few days. Do not completely lose your minds just yet. I will immediately get our elite corporate legal team on the phone, and I personally guarantee we will secure Hua-An's release at absolute breakneck speed. I won't allow him to suffer a single microscopic shred of discomfort while inside. No absolute hell, no Shiji. My mother wailed, hysterically, violently clawing at her arm. Hua-An's health is incredibly fragile. A filthy detention center is a freezing, disease-ridden, absolute hellhole, and they'll force him to be locked up alongside violent, unhinged criminals. How on earth is his delicate body supposed to survive that? The sheer trauma will literally kill him. My father instantly cut in to passionately back up her hysterical protest. And then, as if a sinister light bulb moment suddenly flashed across his brain, he redirected his gaze toward my bruised form lying silently on the VIP mattress. A fleeting microscopic trace of moral hesitation flickered across his eyes, but he ultimately threw all basic human decency out the window, opening his mouth. Mufang. Mufang's physical constitution is 1,000,000 times more resilient than Hua-An's, and his mental state is, well, he's far more hardened and tough. Why don't we just have Mufang take the fall and go to jail in Hua-An's place instead? It's literally just going to be for a couple of days. The very second Shiji pulls the right political strings and completely buries the case will bail him out. The exact millisecond that utterly monstrous proposition left his mouth, even a ruthless corporate tycoon like Jian Shiji was left completely paralyzed with absolute shock. She violently snapped her head around to glare at my father. Uncle, Mufang literally just survived a major life-threatening surgical operation. And just a few days ago, he was brutally assaulted and suffered catastrophic trauma all over his body. Qin Hua-An, however, looked exactly as though he had just grabbed a golden lifeline in a stormy sea, frantically lunging forward to throw his pathetic weight completely onto Jian Shiji, frantically clutching at her sleeve as he begged hysterically, Shiji! Oh my god, please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. I am completely terrified out of my mind, brother. Brother definitely won't mind taking my place, right? Brother, you have to save me. Please save me. Just this one single time, I am begging you. Jian Shiji stared down at Qin Hua-An's utterly terrified, helpless sobbing, and then shifted her gaze toward my battered form lying perfectly motionless on the mattress with closed eyes, causing a violent, agonizing war to erupt deep within her soul. On one hand, she had the pitiful, tear-soaked pleas of the boy she deeply adored, while on the other, she was being suffocated by a microscopic shred of basic sanity, along with a mounting, intensely toxic wave of pure dread and emotional resistance. Right at that exact microsecond, a sharp, heavy knock rattled against the wood of the VIP suite, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped directly across the threshold, flashing their official badges. Which one of you is Qin Hua-An? You are required to accompany us back to the precinct immediately to assist in an ongoing criminal investigation. Qin Hua-An completely lost his damn mind in pure panic, clutching onto Jian Shiji's clothes with a literal death grip, while our biological parents also completely descended into chaotic hysteria, unloading a desperate barrage of pathetic stuttering pleas, directed entirely at the unyielding officers, before shooting intensely frantic, piercing glares toward Jian Shiji and my motionless body. A violent nerve in Jian Shiji's temple began to throb erratically, and pinned beneath Qin Hua-An's despair-filled, tear-soaked expression, alongside the suffocating, desperate demands radiating from my parents' eyes. She ultimately made her choice, delivering a heavy, agonizingly reluctant nod. She turned toward the officers, slowly extending a trembling finger directly at my chest. He is Qin Hua-An. Throughout this entire horrific circus of a betrayal, I didn't utter a single microscopic syllable. I didn't even bother to open my heavy eyelids, remaining completely dead to the world until one of the police officers politely yet firmly demanded that I get out of the hospital bed, at which point I finally systematically peeled my eyes open. My deadpan gaze swept across the room, effortlessly cutting through my parents who were frantically averting their guilty eyes passing over Jian Shiji, whose expression was a chaotic, illegible storm of sheer torment, before finally locking directly onto the smug, intensely relieved face of Qin Hua-An. Without a word, I brutally ripped the IV needle straight out from the back of my bloody hand, slowly swung my battered legs over the edge of the mattress, and stood flat on the cold floor. Jian Shiji stared at my completely calm, terrifyingly hollow demeanor, feeling exactly as though an invisible, demonic hand had violently clamped around her bare heart, crushing it so brutally that she was left physically gasping for oxygen. The absolute second my fragile frame shuffled right past her shoulder, she violently lunged forward, grabbing my bruised arm with an unhinged grip. Mufeng! Her voice was incredibly raspy, cracked, and completely ruined. vibrating with an intense, terrified tremor that even her own brain couldn't comprehend. Just wait for me. Give me 3 days max, I swear to God. I will personally bust you out of that hellhole no matter what it takes. And after this is over, wherever the hell you want to go, whatever you want to do, I will abandon everything just to be right by your side. I will give you endless compensation. Literally, whatever you want, I will make it happen. I halted my forward momentum on the spot, casting a deadpan glance down at the desperate white-knuckled grip she was forcefully maintaining on my bruised arm. Then systematically lifting my head to lock eyes with her, I gently, yet unyieldingly, pried her rigid fingers off me one by one. Without throwing a single word back at her, I turned on my heel, following the officer's step-by-agonizing step out of the VIP suite. Behind my back, my biological mother and father offered a pathetic, weeping defense. Mufeng, please understand we were completely backed into a corner here. The absolute second Huan is safely out of the woods. We swear we will make this up to you and shower you with love. My pace didn't falter or slow down for a single millisecond. Behaving precisely as if they were ghosts, Jian Shijie stood completely paralyzed in place, watching my fragile silhouette systematically vanish around the corner of the corridor. The exact hand I had just unceremoniously pried away remained awkwardly suspended in the dead air, mimicking a hollow clutching motion, trembling violently from an untamed wave of shock. The subsequent 3 days spent locked inside the detention center felt like a literal eternity. The environment was freezing damp and utterly filthy, filled with a chaotic racket alongside the intensely predatory, hostile glares and toxic mocking jeers from the other inmates sharing the block. The slop provided for sustenance was thoroughly repulsive and crude, and I was forced to rest my battered frame on a rock-hard wooden plank, with the severe injuries across my body constantly throbbing in white-hot pain, compounded by the overall biohazardous conditions. I barely managed to catch a single microscopic wink of sleep, yet through it all, I remained hauntingly, beautifully serene, unloading 0 tears, causing absolutely no scenes, and refusing to engage in a single shred of communication with another human soul. I merely existed like a shadow melting silently into my own isolated corner, staring blankly up toward the ceiling, fixated entirely on that single heavily barred window. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, my official release paperwork finally cleared, and I slowly walked out past the massive crushing iron gates of the facility. The outdoor sunlight hit me with blinding, scorching intensity, forcing me to squint my eyes to a microscopic slit, as my pupils desperately adjusted to the sudden brightness. The second I powered my smartphone back on, 2 new text messages immediately pinged across my screen. The first notification was from my biological mother, Mufeng. Your father and I legally have to attend an incredibly exclusive high society charity gala tonight, so we won't be able to drive over to pick you up. Just hail a random taxi and head back home by yourself. Stay safe on the roads. Once we're back, mommy will personally whip up your favorite gourmet dishes to compensate you. The second text message arrived from Jian Shijie Mufeng, the headquarters, abruptly called a critical high-stakes multinational merger and acquisition summit. And I physically cannot slip away right now. Please just head back home by yourself, catch up on some proper sleep, and I will personally come over to see you tonight. After that, I will take you absolutely anywhere you want to go, so just wait for me. My face remained completely expressionless as I finished reading, and then I casually tapped open my social media feed. The very first update that loaded at the top of the screen was a brand new post uploaded by Qin Huan barely 10 minutes ago. Caught a tiny microscopic cold, yet everyone is treating it like an absolute national emergency. It honestly feels so incredible to be deeply cherished and pampered at the absolute center of everyone's universe. Sending endless gratitude to all the people who fiercely love me. Within the attached photograph, my biological father, mother, and Jian Shijie were all huddled around him smiling warmly. The backdrop was the main living room of the Qin family estate, with the coffee table overflowing with gourmet fruits and ultra-premium health supplements. I stared blankly at that social media update, gazing at the genuine radiant smiles carved onto every single person's face, and the absolute pure contentment oozing from the image, before a soft, quiet chuckle suddenly escaped my lips. But as the laughter rippled out, a lone freezing droplet of moisture silently slid down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of deep sorrow, nor was it born from a sense of bitter injustice. It was simply the absolute profound weight of closure as the dust finally settled on my past. Right then, my smartphone buzzed once more with a heavy vibration. It was a brand new email notification, and the moment I tapped it open, the message from my immigration agent filled the screen. Dear Mr. Qin, heartiest congratulations, your official application for international immigration and permanent residency status has been formally and legally approved. We wish you a thoroughly beautiful, brilliant new chapter as you begin your life in a completely fresh country. I stared fixedly at that single line of text for an excruciatingly long time, and then I let out a long, heavy, deep breath from the very bottom of my lungs. It was finally completely over. I hailed a passing taxi and rode it straight back to the luxury Qin family mansion. The entire estate was completely empty and dead silent, obviously because everyone was still coddling Qin Huan elsewhere. I walked directly into my cramped, tiny guest bedroom, retrieved two crucial legal documents from the desk drawer, and placed them perfectly and neatly at the absolute center of the prominent living room coffee table. The first document was a formal declaration of voluntary severance of parental rights and family relations, while the second was a binding mutual agreement to dissolve the marriage engagement. At the bottom of both official papers, my legal signature had already been clearly and cleanly penned. Taking one final sweeping glance around the perimeter, I looked at this house that had never granted me a single microscopic shred of genuine warmth or belonging, extended the handle of the pre-packed suitcase waiting by the door, and turned around, stepping across the threshold without a single millisecond of lingering regret. The night sky had grown profoundly deep and dark as my taxi sped smoothly down the highway toward the international airport. Inside the bustling departure terminal, crowds of travelers were constantly moving back and forth. I quietly took my seat right next to the massive window, staring out at the giant commercial jets constantly ascending and descending along the runway, their navigation lights blinking rhythmically in the dark, like a cluster of distant, isolated stars. The overhead intercom systematically began broadcasting the final boarding announcement. I retrieved my smartphone from my pocket, opening up WeChat one last time to look at the pinned chats at the top of the screen. My biological parents and Jianshijie. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen, freezing in place for a few agonizing seconds, before I resolutely logged out of the application altogether. I popped the SIM card straight out of the slot, snapped it cleanly in half, and carelessly tossed the plastic into a nearby trash bin, grip tightening on the handle of my luggage. I walked directly toward the boarding gate, never casting a single backward glance. Meanwhile, after Jian Shijie finished coddling Qinhua An over his minor cold, she had rushed straight to corporate headquarters to micromanage an emergency business crisis. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, she had finally brought an end to that grueling, incredibly tedious multinational merger and acquisition summit. Stepping out of the executive boardroom, she habitually glanced down at her phone, only to find the lock screen completely blank aside from a few dry corporate emails. There wasn't a single text or missed call from me. Massaging her throbbing temples, she collapsed into the back seat of her luxury car. The chauffeur politely asked for their destination, and though her brain initially wanted to tell him to head to her own penthouse, the words shifted the moment they hit her lips: drive to the Qin estate. The vehicle smoothly glided into the ultra-exclusive residential district, coming to a halt right outside the gates of the Qin mansion. The entire multi-story estate was completely swathed in pitch-black darkness, save for the motion-activated porch light casting a dim, sickly yellow glow. Normally at this exact hour, there would at least be a single nightlight left burning in the living room, but tonight, the entire property felt unnervingly, suffocatingly quiet. Jian Shijie aggressively pressed the doorbell, but after waiting an eternity, there was zero response. That familiar toxic seed of anxiety deep within her chest began to violently expand, prompting her to bypass protocol punch in the security code and unlock the front door herself. The main foyer lights were completely shut off, and the expansive living room was illuminated solely by a solitary floor lamp, casting long, eerie, dim shadows across the space. 3 distinct silhouettes were sitting perfectly motionless on the sofa. My biological father, my mother, and Qinhua An. The atmosphere in the room was terrifyingly heavy, with a suffocating dead silence hanging thick in the air. Jian Shijie swapped her shoes and stepped deeper into the house, her eyes instantly locking onto the absolute center of the living room coffee table, where 2 official legal documents were placed perfectly and squarely side by side. Her footsteps abruptly ground to a halt, as a horrifying catastrophic premonition instantly clamped a death grip around her heart. She frantically lunged forward and snatched up the documents, the pristine white sheets of A4 paper, and the stark black headers, piercing her eyes with blinding painful intensity in the dim shadowed lighting. Declaration of voluntary severance of parental rights and family relations. Mutual agreement to dissolve the marriage engagement. At the very bottom of each page was my clean, elegant signature, pressed so hard it bled through the paper. Resting quietly right beside the paperwork was a solitary ring, the prestigious ancestral engagement band passed down through the Jian family line, which she had personally slipped onto my finger 5 years ago. Since that very day, I had never once taken it off. Jian Shijie stared transfixed at that single piece of jewelry, watching it refract a piercingly cold metallic glint under the lamplight. As her fingertips began to tremble violently and uncontrollably, she snapped her head up with sheer force, her voice sounding incredibly raspy, cracked, and completely strained to the breaking point. What the absolute hell is the meaning of this? Where the fuck is Mufang? My biological mother looked up as if violently jolted awake by her screaming, her eyes bloodshot and completely swollen, her voice instantly cracking into a pathetic, tearful whine. We walked through the door tonight and found these just lying out here. We tried calling his phone 1,000,000 times, but it goes straight to voicemail. His entire bedroom has been completely cleaned out, My father aggressively rubbed his hands over his haggard face, muttering in a hollow, gravelly tone. His passport, his legal identification card, and every single piece of his personal belongings are totally gone. Qin Huan chimed in with a timid, fragile whisper. Is brother seriously still holding a petty grudge against me? This is all completely my fault. Oh, I never should have let him take the fall and go to jail for. Shut the absolute fuck up, Jian Shuji snarled, cutting him off mid-sentence. The sheer, unadulterated venom dripping from her icy tone sent a violent shudder writhing through Qin Huan's entire body, instantly choking the fake tearful whimpers right back down his throat. My biological father and mother stared back at her, completely paralyzed with shock, as Jian Shijie's chest heaved up and down in frantic shallow gasps. Those two flimsy sheets of paper suddenly felt as heavy as a mountain, crushing down on her lungs so violently she could barely draw a single breath. She violently slammed the documents back onto the table, whipped out her smartphone, and with a violently shaking hand dialed the exact 10-digit number burned into her brain. We're sorry, the cellular customer you are trying to reach is currently switched off. The cold synthetic automated voice echoed through the earpiece over and over again. WeChat DM's text messages. Every single avenue of digital communication had vanished into a bottomless, unresponsive void. She violently spun around to face my biological father and mother, her eyes completely bloodshot with raw panic. What exact time did he walk out of this house? When was the absolute last time any of you cheap bastards tried to contact him? My biological mother was absolutely petrified by her terrifying demeanor, feverishly fumbling around to whip out her smartphone, before pulling up the specific text thread and shoving it into her hands. It's this one right here. We fabricated a lie telling him we absolutely had to attend a high society charity gala, and shot him a text telling him to just hail a random taxi back home. The exact moment Jian Shijie locked eyes with that toxic line of text on the screen, it felt as if a heavy sledgehammer had violently smashed straight into her chest. She practically ripped her own device out of her purse, tapping aggressively to open up her chat history. The text message she had personally sent him claiming a corporate summit kept her busy, and promising to check on him later was still sitting there completely unread. The timestamp difference between those two tragic texts was barely a matter of minutes. Both she and my biological parents, at the exact moment I stepped out of that hellhole, battered, bruised, and fundamentally broken, both physically and mentally, had naturally unanimously chosen to utterly abandon me in the dirt, just to go coddle and pamper another person who was completely fine. Jian Shijie let out a low, hollow, deeply bitter laugh. My father stammered pathetically, desperately, attempting to clear his conscience. I genuinely assumed he was just throwing a childish temper tantrum. He's acted out like this in the past, and normally if we just give him the silent treatment for a few days, he comes crawling back. An absolute suffocating tidal wave of pure panic instantly swallowed her whole, refusing to waste another microsecond on the three spineless cowards behind her. She spun on her heel and charged upstairs, clearing the steps in massive strides, before violently slamming my bedroom door open. The entire space was completely hollow and dead. The mattress sheets were tucked in and organized with absolute clinical precision, behaving precisely as if a human soul had never even rested there. The massive wardrobe doors were flung wide open, leaving behind nothing but a few scattered high-end designer garments that either she or the Chin family had forcefully bought for me. Every single piece of my own humble, modest clothing had been completely cleared out. Jian Shijie's frantic gaze swept across the vacant room, finally zoning in on the wastebasket sitting quietly in the corner. Inside lay several jagged, torn fragments of premium photo paper. She marched over, bending down with a trembling frame to retrieve them, slowly, piece by piece, trying to reconstruct the image. It was the one and only photograph she and I had ever taken together. 5 years ago, the exact week I was hauled back to the toxic Chin household, during an official family banquet. I had stood right by her side, looking completely timid, anxious, and out of place, desperately forcing a nervous, vulnerable smile for the camera lens. The version of me captured in that old photograph still possessed eyes sparkling with cautious, desperate hope, and a radiant desire to be loved. And now that very same photograph had been deliberately, systematically, ripped to shreds by my own hands and tossed into the garbage like worthless trash. Jian Shijie's grip on the fragments was so intensely violent that her knuckles turned stark white, the jagged razor-sharp edges of the torn paper slicing deep into her skin, causing a sharp, stinging pain. Stumbling backward, she staggered blindly toward the bedside nightstand and violently yanked open the main drawer, only to find a few discarded books left behind. She frantically flipped through them page by page, but absolutely nothing was hidden inside. Refusing to accept total defeat, she desperately dragged open the very bottom drawer, revealing an old, weathered tin box resting silently in the dark. Jian Shijie's heart skipped a violent, erratic beat. She carefully lifted the tin container, her fingertips trembling uncontrollably as she pried open the metal lid. The contents kept inside were devastatingly sparse. Resting right at the top was a completely shriveled, heavily yellowed plastic wet wipe wrapper. She froze completely, staring blankly for a few solid seconds. Before a vivid memory violently struck her, it was from my very first day returning to the Chin mansion. As I stood there utterly paralyzed with crippling anxiety staring down at my muddy shoes, she had knelt down, casually pulled out a single wet wipe, and thoroughly cleaned the dirt stains off my sneakers. This was the wrapper she had discarded. Beneath that plastic souvenir lay a heavily tarnished, fading luxury men's wristwatch, the exact first birthday present she had ever bought me. Back then, she was still thoroughly consumed by intense, blinding fury over Qin Huan being forced out of the household, unloading all her misplaced toxic resentment directly onto my head, and had carelessly grabbed this watch at a random department store, without wasting a single second to look at the style. Yet I had fiercely cherished it as if it were a priceless, sacred artifact, wearing it faithfully every single day until the leather strap completely snapped. Directly underneath the watch lay a heavily crumpled sheet of medical paper, which had been meticulously and carefully smoothed back out. Jian Shiji lifted the document, catching a glimpse of the heading, and every drop of blood in her veins instantly turned to pure ice. It was my official ultrasound scan report, the edges of the paper permanently stained with long-dried heavy tear tracks that had severely smeared the ink across the page. Jian Shiji could barely maintain her grip on this incredibly flimsy, weightless piece of paper. It turned out I had never been completely indifferent to the loss. I had simply buried all of my agonizing trauma directly into this dark corner, before systematically destroying my own hope. At the absolute bottom of the box sat a vintage craft paper leather notebook, my personal diary. Jian Shiji took a ragged deep breath and cracked it open. The earliest entries were written during my initial return to the Qin family, every single sentence practically bleeding with absolute anxiety over this terrifying new life. A profoundly cautious, desperate yearning to be loved by my biological parents, alongside a deeply hidden, unspoken infatuation with her that I never dared to voice out loud. But the further she flipped through the pages, the more frantic and unhinged the handwriting became, oozing a progressively suffocating wave of pure, unadulterated despair. The very final page was dated, with today's date featuring a solitary line of text written with such violent force that the pen had practically sliced completely through the paper. Today I can finally escape this living hell. Mom, Dad Jian Shiji, goodbye. No, actually, let's make it never see you again. A single splash of warm moisture slammed heavily onto the open notebook, instantly smearing the fresh ink. Jian Shiji raised a completely numb hand to her face in utter disbelief, only to feel her entire countenance drenched in a freezing, rolling wave of tears. Qin Huan had crept up behind her completely unannounced, hovering right at the threshold of the bedroom door as he watched Jian Shiji's, violently shaking back and the raw journal clutched tightly in her trembling grip. A fleeting glint of venomous malice flashed deep within his eyes, before he instantly masked it behind a pathetic, deeply wronged expression. Shijie, look, brother is probably just in a terrible headspace right now. He definitely just went out to clear his head and blow off some steam. I'm sure he'll wander right back home in a couple of days, Oak. To blow off some steam, Jian Shijie spun around with violent force, her eyes completely bloodshot and chaotic, her voice sounding as raw, cracked, and ruined as a broken pair of bellows. You think someone signs a parental severance decree and a marriage dissolution just to clear their head? She began backing him down step by aggressive step, her gaze cutting into him like a razor-sharp blade. For the absolute first time in her life, she was directing a glare fueled by pure unadulterated hatred toward this exact golden boy whom she had previously coddled and protected above all else. The frozen warehouse trap, the hit-and-run accident, and every single scratch on your body, she enunciated every syllable with lethal precision, each word dripping with absolute ice. Qin Huan, look me dead in the eye and answer me honestly. Did you seriously not fabricate a single microscopic lie through this entire nightmare? Qin Huan's complexion instantly turned as white as a ghost, instinctively taking a frantic step backward. Shijie, are you seriously interrogating me right now? Do even you refuse to believe me? Hearing the explosive commotion from the hallway, my biological mother barged into the room, immediately throwing her entire body in front of Qin Huan to shield him, glaring at Jian Shiji with intense resentment. How about dare you use that hostile tone with my precious Huan? Mufeng made the conscious, deliberate choice to pack up and walk out on his own. What the hell does his dramatic exit have to do with Huan? He's always been overly sensitive and unstable. Who else is there to blame for his own dynamic meltdowns? Jian Shiji stared blankly at the scene before her eyes, at the mother and son clinging to each other with a fierce protective grip, and at my biological father hovering awkwardly by the doorframe, completely silent. In that exact microsecond, she found the entire dynamic to be profoundly grotesque and utterly devastatingly laughable. It was an absolute circus. Over these past 5 miserable years, what kind of absolute farcical delusion had she been living in? And what on earth had she done to the one man who had genuinely, unconditionally loved her? Get the fuck out! She barked, pointing a rigid finger directly toward the door, her voice dropping into an icy sub-zero register completely devoid of human warmth. Every single one of you, get the absolute hell out of my sight. My biological mother was thoroughly paralyzed by the sheer unadulterated venom flashing in her eyes, yet she tried to speak up, only to be aggressively yanked back by my father. My father. cast a deeply convoluted, heavy glance at the practically unhinged manic Jian Shijie, let out a defeated ragged sigh, and forcefully dragged the reluctant Qin Huan and his highly resentful mother straight out of the bedroom. The moment the door slammed shut, Jian Shijie collapsed weakly, sinking straight down onto the freezing hardwood floor, propping her trembling back against the edge of the hollow, vacant bed. She continued to clutch that crumpled medical ultrasound report and the leather-bound diary with a desperate, suffocating tightness, squeezing them until her knuckles turned a bloodless, stark white. Suddenly, a sharp, jolting realization struck her brain like a lightning bolt, and she began frantically, messily fumbling around to whip out her smartphone, before aggressively dialing a private number. "It's me, Jian Shijie. I need you to pull up the security logs for the Jingshan Luxury Villa District immediately, along with every single scrap of street surveillance from this afternoon, tracking the entire route from the detention center back to the Qin mansion. Map out every single camera feed along the way. Yes, right now." This very instant, her words were practically tripping over one another, her voice cracking into an unstable, erratic pitch fueled by pure unadulterated desperation and panic, pacing back and forth like a manic cornered beast. Within the hollow walls of the empty bedroom, the sheer pressure building in her chest felt like it was going to violently explode. She had never experienced a terror this profound in her entire existence. Not even years ago, when the entire Jian Corporation faced its most catastrophic financial crisis and hovered right on the precarious brink of absolute bankruptcy, had she ever felt this fundamentally shattered, helpless, and completely lost. As she waited for the security team to extract the surveillance data, every single tick of the clock felt like a slow, agonizing eternity of psychological torture. Finally, at 2 a.m., the phone violently vibrated and she snapped it up. "Miss Jian, we managed to track him down." At approximately 5 o'clock p.m. this afternoon, Mr. Qin walked out past the main villa gates entirely by himself, dragging a single suitcase. He stood at the curb, completely motionless for about 3 solid minutes, casting one final sweeping glance back at the property before getting into a commercial taxi. The license plate number is, and the final drop-off location was, Jian Shijie urgently interjected, her voice sharp with panic, "the international airport." Yes, we immediately ran a comprehensive trace on the airport's customs and border control logs. He boarded an international flight that departed tonight at precisely 9:40 p.m., flying completely direct to Toronto, Canada. Jian Shijie's brain instantly erupted into a loud, deafening buzz. She aggressively snatched up her car keys and bolted straight out the door. The midnight city streets were completely desolate and barren, allowing her to slam the accelerator pedal flat against the floorboard, recklessly street racing her way all the way to the airport terminal. She practically lunged across the customer service counter, flashing her elite credentials, demanding they instantly pull up the comprehensive outbound manifest for every single flight that had departed that evening. The duty manager was thoroughly petrified by her raw, bloodshot eyes and her utterly terrifying, menacing aura, not daring to stall her for even a single microsecond, as he immediately initiated a high-priority system search. "Miss Jian, as for the long-haul flights heading out to Canada tonight, there was only a single scheduled departure at 9:40 p.m., traveling completely nonstop directly to Toronto. And according to the official passenger manifest, a Mr. Qin Mufang was indeed on board." The confirmation hit home, causing Jian Shiji to squeeze her eyes shut tightly, desperately choking back the bitter metallic taste of blood rising in her throat. "I demand to see his exact comprehensive passenger details right now. I need his exact residential address and current contact info in Canada. Miss Jian, we are legally bound by strict passenger privacy laws and have zero authority to disclose ushkig. Cut the bureaucratic crap and get me your regional general manager on the line. Right this fucking second, Ulk." Jian Shijie completely snapped, losing every single ounce of her composure, her voice turning so sharply hysterical that it forced everyone nearby to turn and stare. After jumping through endless corporate hoops and pulling every string imaginable, by 4 a.m., she finally managed to secure a single address and a newly registered phone number. The address mapped directly to a dirt-cheap, sketchy youth hostel located in Toronto, while the phone number was a temporary Canadian burner SIM card that, when dialed this very second, already automated straight to a disconnected message. Jian Shiji stared blankly at that string of text and numbers, feeling her heart sink straight into a bottomless, freezing abyss. With a violently shaking finger, she manually booked herself a seat on the absolute earliest available flight, heading directly out to Toronto, which wasn't scheduled to depart until tomorrow at noon. By the time she finally shuffled out of the massive airport terminal, the horizon was already starting to bleed a pale, sickly dawn light. The late autumn morning breeze was utterly brutal and piercingly cold, whipping violently against her frame, which was clad only in a paper-thin dress shirt. Yet she couldn't feel a single ounce of the freezing temperature outside. All she could feel was a massive hollow void torn open in the absolute center of her chest, with the bitter freezing wind howling relentlessly through her soul. She blindly navigated her vehicle all the way back to the Qin family estate, where the main living room lights were still burning bright. My biological father and mother were still slouched on the sofa, staring at each other in stunned silence. The absolute second they caught sight of her walking through the door, my mother bolted straight to her feet, anxiously interrogating Shiji. "What's the situation? Did you manage to track down Mufeng's?" Jan Shiji's voice was completely shot, sounding incredibly raspy and ruined. "He fled the country to Toronto, Canada. I booked a high-priority flight tomorrow at noon to go hunt him down." My mother froze completely in absolute shock, and as a horrifying realization suddenly crashed over her mind, her entire face drained of color, turning stark white. "Canada. But his entire body is still battered and severely injured. He literally just underwent major surgery? For him to run off all alone to a place that far away, what if he does something drastic? What if he, no he won't." Jan Shijie aggressively cut her off mid-sentence, though it was utterly ambiguous whether she was desperately trying to convince my mother, or frantically gaslighting herself. "He won't do that. I am absolutely going to find him. No matter what it takes." She practically spat out those final words through gritted teeth, yet she couldn't mask the severe trembling terror vibrating through her voice. My father buried his face in his hands in pure unadulterated agony, his voice choking up with heavy tears. "It's our fault. We are the ones who relentlessly pushed him over the edge and drove him away." Jan Shiji stared dead at this pathetic couple who, in the span of a single night, looked as if they had prematurely aged by a whole decade. Yet she couldn't summon a single microsecond of sympathy for them. All that remained inside her was a hollow, freezing numbness, and the deeply pathetic realization that they were all suffering from the exact same self-inflicted curse. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the Chin estate, bypassing her own home entirely, and drove straight to the corporate headquarters instead. The morning sun was completely up by now, illuminating the vast CEO executive suite, which felt entirely hollow and freezing cold. She walked over and unlocked a private storage locker that she almost never bothered to open in the past, only to find it stuffed completely to the brim with every single memory of me. There lay all the handmade gifts I had personally crafted for her birthday every year. Gifts that were admittedly a bit clumsy, yet radiating pure devotion. A hand-knitted winter scarf, with highly uneven, crooked stitching. A meticulously handwritten anthology of poetry, penned in flawless neat script. A custom molded clay mug that was warped into a bizarre, irregular shape. And an entire mountain of financial magazine clippings, media reports, and interview transcripts featuring her. Even the rare paparazzi photos, capturing a blurry silhouette of her side profile. I had carefully clipped out every single one and organized them neatly inside a scrapbook. Beneath that lay a thick stack of commercial flight ticket stubs and boarding passes, spanning endless domestic and international destinations. Every single city matched the exact locations of her corporate business trips, with the timestamps revealing that I had deliberately booked myself onto the exact same flights as her, and even secured lodging at the very same hotels. She lived high luxury in the premium presidential suites, while I quietly retreated into the cheapest economy rooms available. At the absolute bottom of the locker sat a massive glass jar, stuffed completely to the brim with vibrant multicolored paper cranes. Affixed to the smooth surface of the glass was a small sticky note. 999 cranes. Just one single wish away from absolute fulfillment. Jian Shiji's frame trembled violently as she pried open the lid, pouring out a small handful of the delicate paper cranes, before carefully unfolding one of the yellowed slips of paper. Etched across the surface was my signature neat, elegant handwriting. Caught a glimpse of Shiji in a business magazine today. She looks absolutely breathtaking. I finally mastered brewing her favorite Blue Mountain blend. But she didn't come home tonight. It's okay, Jian Shijie. I will continue to wait for you forever, until the day you finally notice me. Jian Shiji collapsed onto the floor, propping her weight against the freezing metal locker door, cradling those deconstructed paper cranes carefully in her palms, staring at the sea of notes scattered across the floor that detailed my deepest secrets. She completely lost all composure, her shoulders racking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. Massive, scalding hot tears slammed heavily onto the fragile paper, bleeding into wide, blurry pools of moisture that erased the ink. Jen Shijie aggressively dialed her executive assistant, demanding, "What does my schedule look like tomorrow?" At 10 a.m., you have the high-stakes M&A summit with the Gaoshen Group. Then at 2 p.m., a municipal project negotiation, followed by, clear the entire docket, push everything back. Jan Shijie aggressively cut her off, her voice sounding completely ruined and hoarse. "Wait, what?" The assistant gasped, assuming she had severely misheard. "Listen to me. Cancel every single booking." Jen Shiji repeated herself with absolute chilling clarity, pausing intentionally. "Cancel every single appointment on my calendar for the next 6 months. Delegate absolute authority to the vice president. Unless this entire conglomerate is on the absolute verge of liquidation, do not dare to disturb me for any reason." The assistant on the other end of the line was completely paralyzed with utter shock. Jen Shiji took a ragged, heavy breath, before coldly appending one more thing. Moving forward, anything concerning Qin Huan or the rest of the Qin household is strictly banned from being reported to me. The moment the words left her lips, she terminated the call and aggressively tossed her phone aside. She stared blankly out the window at the skyline as dawn gradually broke, watching the massive metropolis slowly awaken from its deep slumber, the streets immediately flooding with heavy traffic, radiating the exact same hollow, endless luxury as always. Yet her entire world, from the exact microsecond she stepped through the Qin family doors last night, and locked eyes with those two devastating legal documents sitting on the coffee table, had already violently ruptured and collapsed into absolute nothingness, leaving behind nothing but a vast barren wasteland. She had completely lost me with zero way to track me down. This terrifying realization caused a freezing, paralyzing wave of horror to course through her entire body. "Mufeng," she whimpered softly to the empty, vacant air, her voice completely shattered and broken into microscopic pieces. "Just wait for me. This time it's my turn to chase after you, no matter what corner of the world you're hiding in, no matter how many agonizing years it takes, or what insane price I have to pay. I swear to God, I will find you." Throughout the grueling 12-hour international flight, Jian Shiji remained completely hypervigilant, unable to sleep a single wink. The second the massive aircraft touched down in Toronto, at the Pearson International Airport, the local sky was already bleeding into a dim twilight. The late autumn Canadian wind blew with a brutal biting chill, underneath an incredibly gloomy overcast sky. Jian Shiji couldn't care less about processing her severe jet lag. She bolted out of the airport terminal, hailed a local commercial taxi, and ordered the driver to speed straight toward that exact youth hostel. The establishment was tucked away on a noticeably run-down, sketchy side street, featuring a remarkably cramped and unassuming storefront. The moment she aggressively pushed the front door open, a suffocating wave of pungent odor blending cheap chemical disinfectant with a chaotic mix of stale body sweat from international travelers slammed directly into her face. A few young rowdy backpackers were lounging around the sketchy lobby, shouting and laughing loudly in a dozen different foreign languages. Manning the front desk was an elderly, gray-haired Chinese woman who was hunched over a newspaper peering through a pair of reading glasses. Jian Shiji advanced toward her with rapid, aggressive strides, interrogating her in a frantic, high-strung burst of English. "Excuse me, I am desperately searching for a specific guest. His name is Qin Mufeng, a Chinese man. He checked in roughly a week ago." The elderly woman hoisted her head, adjusting her thick frames, as she thoroughly sized up the stranger standing before her. The woman pacing in front of her counter wore incredibly high-end designer apparel and radiated an unmistakable elite aura of absolute wealth. Yet her eyes were severely bruised with deep dark circles, and her entire countenance was warped with pure manic desperation, looking profoundly out of place inside this bottom-tier budget hostel. "Mr. Qin?" the old woman pondered for a brief moment, before slowly shaking her head. "He only stayed here for a solitary night, and checked out early the very next morning." Jian Shiji felt her heart violently drop into her stomach. Did he mention where he was heading? Did he leave behind any forward address or alternative contact info? The old lady set her newspaper down flat onto the desk, locking the eyes with her, before suddenly switching into a heavily accented Mandarin dialect, asking, "Tell me, girl, what exactly are you to him?" Jian Shiji froze, completely caught off guard for a microsecond, before instinctively blurting out, I am his fiancé." "His fiancé, huh?" The elderly woman's lips contorted into a deeply mocking, sarcastic sneer, as she thoroughly scanned her from head to toe, her gaze piercing and incredibly sharp. "I was the one pulling the night shift when Mr. Qin checked in that evening." The poor kid could barely balance his own weight when he stumbled through that door, his face flushed with a completely unnatural severe fever. He kept clutching his forehead, coughing violently, without a single second of relief. I explicitly asked him if he was severely ill, and offered to call an emergency medical team to help him out, but he just weakly shook his head, whispering that it wasn't necessary, that he was simply utterly exhausted. The old lady paused intentionally, casting an increasingly chilling, judgmental glare directly at Jian Shiji. Later on in the dead of night, I heard muffled sobbing echoing down the hall. It was incredibly faint, yet it persisted for hours without a single break. So I got up from my desk to investigate, only to find him curled up completely alone in the absolute darkest corner of the hallway corridor. He was hugging his knees tight against his chest, weeping so intensely that his entire frame was shaking violently. I brought him a hot mug of water, but when he reached out to take it, his skin felt as terrifyingly cold as pure ice. He couldn't even summon the breath to voice a proper thank you. He just kept weeping helplessly. Jian Shiji stood completely paralyzed, as if her boots had been permanently cemented to the floor. Every single sentence spilling from the old lady's lips felt like a lethal ice-capped blade, viciously plunging straight into the absolute center of her heart, ruthlessly twisting and tearing her soul to shreds. Burning up with a severe fever, coughing until his lungs were raw, and curled up entirely alone in a dark corner, weeping helplessly. Then, where did he go after that? Jian Shiji heard her own voice cracking and trembling uncontrollably, sounding completely parched and shattered like. The elderly woman retracted her sharp gaze, her tone flattening out into a dull, monotonous drone. The very next morning, long before the sun had even begun to rise, he dragged his suitcase right back out the door. His face was as stark white as a blank sheet of paper, looking so incredibly frail that a gentle autumn breeze could have knocked him dead flat. She locked eyes with Jian Shijie once more, adding, "Listen to me, young lady. I can clearly tell that you come from immense wealth and privilege." But that poor boy, the spark in his eyes was completely dead. He was someone whose soul had been thoroughly, systematically demolished. If you actually harbor an ounce of genuine care for him, stop hunting him down. Grant the poor soul a mercy card and let him survive, and finally let go of your own toxic obsession. Jian Shiji stood utterly stranded on the alien city street, right outside the threshold of that dimly lit, sketchy hostel door. The brutal late autumn wind whipped aggressively down her wide-open collar. Yet she knew with terrifying certainty that the bitter elements were nothing compared to the cold. Boundless tide of pure unadulterated panic completely paralyzing her from the inside out. But how could she possibly stop hunting for him if she truly lost me forever? The entire remainder of her miserable life would be spent rotting away in a literal, living hell. Jian Shijie aggressively forced her racing mind to cool down. She immediately mobilized every single high-level connection she possessed across Canada, rallying the elite networks of the local Chinese Chamber of Commerce, retaining the absolute most expensive top-tier private intelligence investigators, and even resorting to highly illegal black market assets, in a desperate attempt to breach the local social security databases for a digital footprint. But I had already completely dissolved like a single teardrop lost in a vast, infinite ocean, vanishing from the face of the earth without a single trace. It was as if I had meticulously orchestrated this grand exit long in advance, systematically severing every single thread that could ever be tracked back to me. That specific youth hostel address was almost certainly a calculated smokescreen I had intentionally left behind to throw her off the scent, right when she was at her absolute wit's end, completely losing her mind and sinking into total despair. Qin Huaan's international calling ID suddenly flashed violently across her phone screen. The second she picked up, his voice oozed with a meticulously manufactured pathetic vulnerability. Masked beneath a thinly veiled, highly manipulative probe, "Shiji, when are you finally planning to come back home to us? With you gone, Mom, Dad, and I are completely lost and falling apart. Mom and Dad have been so incredibly spaced out lately. They just can't stop bringing up Big Brother over and over again. Are you out there obsessing over Brother too?" If this were the past, hearing him whine with that signature coddled tone of manufactured hurt and absolute codependency, Jian Shiji would have immediately softened her posture and offered sweet, comforting reassurances. But right now, her entire mind and soul were completely haunted by my pale, sickly face, and the haunting silhouette of my absolute erasure. Qin Huaan's toxic, overly theatrical performance only triggered a massive wave of profound gut-wrenching disgust deep inside her. "I'm tied up," she muttered, her voice incredibly aloof and dripping with pure exhausted apathy. Qin Huaan, completely oblivious to the dangerous shift in her tone, pushed his luck further. He continued to layer on that signature, wildly gaslighting act of pure innocence mixed with pathetic entitlement. "Shijie, you're seriously out there hunting for Big Brother, aren't you? If you ask me, since Brother made the conscious, deliberate choice to pack up and walk out on his own, you should just let the guy vanish. He never truly belonged in our elite high society circle anyway. Forcing him back to whatever low-class environment he crawled out of is honestly the best thing for him." Qin Huaan, Jian Shiji violently cut him off mid-sentence, her voice turning into a razor-sharp shard of absolute ice, radiating a level of lethal authority and pure, unadulterated rage he had never experienced in his life. The line instantly dropped into a dead, terrified silence as Jian Shijie gripped her smartphone, her knuckles turning a bloodless, stark white from the raw force of her fury. Every single syllable was aggressively spat out through her tightly clenched teeth. "He is my Jian Shijie's one and only fiancé. As for where exactly he belongs on this earth, it is absolutely not your place as a pathetic outsider to judge. Furthermore, watch your damn mouth when speaking about him. What the hell do you mean by his original low-class environment? And what do you mean by he doesn't belong in our elite high society world? Lest you forget, you are nothing but the fraudulent fake young master here." Qin Huaan was clearly thoroughly traumatized by her explosive fury, allowing several solid seconds of dead silence to pass before whimpering in a deeply wounded tone. "Shijie, how could you possibly speak to me with such utter venom? I'm your precious Huaan." "Save your breath," Jian Shiji barked, completely done wasting another millisecond on his drama, as she ruthlessly terminated the call mid-sentence. Listening to the aggressive, rhythmic dial tone echoing from her smartphone, she collapsed her exhausted weight against the freezing, unforgiving brick wall, staring blankly out the window at the flashing neon lights of this completely alien metropolis. The precise location where her heart used to beat felt entirely hollowed out, pulsing with an endless agonizing ache. One grueling week later, the team of elite private intelligence investigators finally managed to extract a microscopic sliver of a lead. It turned out that a full month prior to fleeing the country, I had, already meticulously, secretly finalized all the paperwork for my permanent residency status in Canada. And just a mere couple of days ago, the newly registered Canadian bank account officially linked to my legal name had triggered a small digital transaction at a local community medical clinic situated right in the heart of Quebec. Quebec, Jen Shijie gasped, feeling exactly like a drowning victim desperately wrapping their fingers around a final, fragile straw. She instantly booked a high-priority ticket on the absolute earliest flight heading directly into the Quebec province that very night. The moment she touched down in Quebec, it was the dead of night. This historic, heavily French-speaking territory felt profoundly eerie silent and completely foreign underneath the midnight shadows. Following the precise GPS coordinates, she successfully tracked down that specific community clinic. The medical center was incredibly cramped and unassuming, featuring healthcare equipment that looked visibly outdated and worn. She marched straight up to the front desk to declare her urgent intentions, demanding to review the comprehensive medical logs of a Chinese national by the name of Qin Mufeng. The receptionist on duty was a brunette, hazel-eyed, middle-aged woman who courteously yet unflinchingly shut her down, citing strict legal mandates regarding patient confidentiality. Jian Shiji completely refused to accept defeat, insisting she was fully prepared to wire any astronomical sum of money required, or negotiate directly with the hospital's executive board directors. Yet the nurse simply continued to shake her head, her firm demeanor offering absolutely zero room for compromise or debate. With the channel of communication totally deadlocked, Jian Shijie completely refused to retreat from the area. She immediately relocated to a small, unassuming sidewalk cafe directly across the street from the clinic, and stubbornly took a seat, remaining absolutely anchored to that exact spot for 3 grueling days. Her bloodshot eyes were intensely, uninterruptedly locked onto every single individual passing through the clinic's main entrance. She absolutely could not afford to miss a single solitary possibility. The late autumn chill of Quebec was turning increasingly brutal, yet Jian Shijie was clad only in a remarkably thin, paper-thin wool overcoat. As she sat out in the freezing open-air patio seating, forcing down cup after cup of bitter, scalding black coffee, in a desperate attempt to weaponize the caffeine against the biting frost and the crushing waves of exhaustion. Driven by pure manic anxiety, the dark purple shadows beneath her eyes grew dangerously deep, leaving her looking completely haggard, shattered, and thoroughly unhinged. A stark, jarring contrast to the leisurely, idyllic French-Canadian aesthetic surrounding her. Finally, on the afternoon of the third agonizing day, she spotted a somewhat familiar nurse's face, exiting through the clinic's secure side doors, apparently preparing to clock out after wrapping up her grueling shift. Jian Shijie bolted upright instantly, sprinting across the pavement in a matter of seconds, to aggressively intercept the healthcare worker right in her tracks. "Forgive me. Please just give me a single moment of your time," she pleaded in a rapid-fire frantic burst of English, simultaneously ripping out her smartphone and flashing a digital photo of my face. "I need to know if you've recently treated or crossed paths with this exact man. He's a Chinese national, incredibly frail and emaciated, standing roughly about this tall." She gestured frantically in the air to indicate my height. The nurse caught herself off guard for a brief microsecond, staring deeply at the digital image on the screen, then shifting her gaze to register the manic explosive desperation written all over Jian Shijie's face. After an agonizing moment of internal hesitation, she lowered her voice, murmuring in heavily accented English, "Yes, there was indeed a certain Mr. Chin here. He came into our facility roughly a week ago for a critical follow-up evaluation." Jian Shijie's heart violently skipped a massive beat, her vocal cords tightening into a strained, suffocating knot. A follow-up evaluation? What the hell happened to him? What kind of severe medical condition is he suffering from? The nurse dropped her voice down to a cautious whisper. Honestly, his clinical prognosis looked incredibly grim. He was battling a severe post-operative infection stemming from a major gastric surgery which triggered systemic inflammation. Furthermore, he has complex unresolved rib fractures that haven't even begun to heal properly, alongside an extensive array of severe soft tissue trauma scattered across his body. Even though the deep contusions and bruising had started to fade slightly, it was still highly visible. The poor soul arrived at our clinic entirely unattended, terribly underweight with a deeply sickly complexion, and looking completely drained of every single ounce of blood or life. Then where exactly is he residing right now? Do you have any idea where he's staying? Jian Shijie's frantic voice was laced with a violent, unstable tremor that she wasn't even consciously aware of. The nurse slowly shook her head. "I honestly have absolutely no data on that. However, he did intensely question me about the best routes to Montreal, specifically asking about the daily passenger train timetables. It is highly probable that he departed for Montreal. Montreal, yet another concrete thread of hope." Jian Shiji felt a sudden rush of overwhelming emotion, nearly weeping tears of pure joy. She aggressively showered the woman with endless words of gratitude, ripping open her designer leather wallet, and forcefully shoving every single bill of cash she had directly into the nurse's hands. Thank you so incredibly much. The nurse caught herself completely off guard, frantically trying to push the massive stack of currency back. But Jian Shijie had already spun on her heel, sprinting wildly toward the curb, to hail an oncoming commercial taxi to rush directly to the train terminal. The absolute millisecond she dove into the backseat of the vehicle, just as she was about to order the driver to speed off toward the station. Her smartphone vibrated violently with an incoming call. It was her executive assistant calling all the way from back home. CEO Jian, a highly critical situation has just developed that requires your immediate attention. The assistant's voice reported sounding incredibly solemn and weighed down with severe gravity. Mr. Qin Huaan, just around noon today, local time, officially published a massive long-form expose across all of his personal public social media profiles. A sudden icy spike of an incredibly dark premonition shot straight through Jian Shijie's chest. What exactly does the post state? She demanded. The assistant paused intentionally, seemingly calculatedly weighing every single word before proceeding. The narrative is drafted with extreme subtext and manipulation, but the overarching theme heavily weaponizes allegations that the eldest young Master Qin, driven by pure toxic jealousy toward him, repeatedly orchestrated elaborate traps to sabotage and ruin his reputation, even going so far as to inflict horrific physical trauma onto his own body to fabricate a malicious frame-up. He further alleges that the eldest young master ruthlessly abandoned his aging parents to flee the country, labeling it an act of supreme unforgivable filial impiety that left the broken elderly couple to weep themselves to sleep in an empty home every single night. As we speak, the digital court of public opinion has completely caught fire and is spreading aggressively. An absolute army of toxic internet users are brutally attacking and doxing Mr. Qin Mufang. Jian Shiji's countenance instantly darkened into a terrifying lethal storm of pure unadulterated rage. She violently terminated the voice call and immediately logged onto the domestic mainstream media applications. Sure enough, Qin Huaan's meticulously manufactured, highly manipulative sob story was already violently climbing up the tail end of the real-time trending charts. The entire text was structured with toxic performative prose and dripping with calculated victimhood. He painted an elaborate picture of how he had returned to the biological Qin family, and how desperately he had slaved away just to earn his older brother's grace and forgiveness, only to be repeatedly targeted, sabotaged, and brutally harmed by his envious brother. From the freezing ice locker incident to the catastrophic car crash, and every single trauma marked on his body, he claimed his brother willfully abandoned the country, leaving behind their elderly, heartbroken parents to rot. Every single line was meticulously crafted to paint himself as the ultimate saint, the selfless victim carrying the heavy burden for the sake of the family, while I was completely demonized as a vicious, unfilial, and ungrateful monster. Predictably, the comment section erupted into an absolute toxic cesspool of pure hate. Jian Shiji stared blankly at the disgusting, unhinged insults hurled at me, the veins in her temples throbbing violently, as an explosive, lethal rage threatened to tear right through her chest. Without a second of hesitation, she dialed his number back with extreme aggression. The phone rang out for an agonizingly long time before it was finally answered. Qin Huaan's voice immediately trickled through the receiver, oozing with that signature pathetic whine. Shijie, delete it, now. Jian. Shiji's voice was absolute ice, cutting harder than a sub-zero Siberian blizzard, completely devoid of a single ounce of human warmth. Qin Huaan was visibly paralyzed, stunned into a dead silence by her deadly tone. A few agonizing seconds ticked by before he stammered in complete disbelief. Shijie, you're actually commanding me to delete my post. Every single word I wrote is the absolute truth, big brother. He literally did all of those, the truth. Jian Shiji let out a savage, mocking sneer. A dark, chilling laugh that radiated straight through the speaker, striking pure terror into his soul. What fucking truth are you talking about? Is it the truth that you intentionally drove your own vehicle straight into his car? Is it the truth that you deliberately mutilated your own body just to frame him for assault? Or is it the truth that you practically begged him on your hands and knees to take the fall for your crimes? Qin Huaan, do you seriously want me to unearth the unedited full surveillance footage of that accident, alongside the offshore bank account ledgers of those corrupt eyewitnesses you meticulously paid off, and package it all nicely for the mainstream media? Shall we let the entire world see what your absolute truth actually looks like? The other end of the line dropped instantly into a horrific dead silence. The only sound remaining was Qin Huaan's sudden ragged and utterly terrified hyperventilation. How do you... His voice shook violently, completely unable to sustain his heavily manufactured innocent facade any longer. How do I know? Jian Shijie's tone was terrifyingly, unnaturally calm, yet it carried a lethal, suffocating aura of absolute authority. Qin Huaan, in the past, I was simply too checked out to look into your games. I wasn't an idiot. The blind spots in the ice locker's security cameras, the severe anomalies at the crash site, and the forensic medical evaluations detailing the exact nature of your self-inflicted wounds. Do you honestly need me to lay every single piece of evidence flat before your eyes? Shijie, no, that's not how it happened. Listen to me. Just let me explain. I only did it because I love you so damn much. Qin Huan finally lost all of his composure, completely entering panic mode. As he desperately tried to gaslight her with toxic affection, I was just so insanely in love with you. I only wanted you to look at me for once. I messed up, okay? I swear I finally realized how wrong I was. Don't you dare mention love to me. Jian Shijie aggressively cut him off mid-sentence, her voice completely dripping with utter mockery and absolute disgust. Whether you're actually in love with me or if you're just obsessed with the supreme power that comes with being the future son-in-law of the massive Jian conglomerate, you know the damn answer to that better than anyone else. Qin Huan, it wasn't until Mufang packed up and vanished, leaving me completely shattered and drowning in agonizing pain, that I finally realized something. In the past, I was completely blind, mistaking our childhood nostalgic bond for actual genuine love. But right now, even the mere memory of that nostalgic bond makes me violently sick to my stomach. Consider this my absolute final warning to you. Immediately, and I mean right fucking now, scrub that absolute garbage post from existence, and then issue a massive, highly public apology directly to Mufang, explicitly debunking every single malicious lie you fabricated. If you refuse, I won't hesitate for a single second to weaponize the full crushing weight of the Jian family empire, to ensure that you, along with every single media rat who helped spread your fake rumors, are dragged kicking and screaming to the exact dark corner where you belong, so you can rot away and think about what you've done. The absolute second she finished speaking, she didn't give Qin Huan a single millisecond to beg or make excuses, ruthlessly and cleanly terminating the voice call. She then instantly patched through to her high-level corporate executive assistant, her order sounding incredibly sharp and absolute. Listen to me. I need 2 tasks executed immediately. First, mobilize every single asset at maximum speed to completely kill the algorithmic traffic on Qin Huan's toxic post. Blacklist and permanently ban every single related hashtag or search term. Second, under my exclusive personal authority, as well as the official corporate branding of the Jian Corporation. A dual ironclad strike from both the company and myself, Jian Shijie. Draft and publish an absolute official legal statement. Exactly 30 minutes later, a fiercely worded, incredibly hostile legal declaration was blasted out from the official corporate handles of the Jian Group, simultaneously cross-posted onto Jian Shijie's verified personal social accounts. The synchronized drops instantly triggered an absolute nuclear explosion across the entire digital landscape. The official document stated with absolute clarity, CEO Jian Shijie hereby issues this solemn binding declaration. Every single piece of trending slander, toxic narrative, and malicious character assassination targeted against Mr. Qin Mufang over the past few days is entirely fabricated, baseless fiction weaponized by deeply corrupt individuals with hidden agendas. Furthermore, Mr. Qin Mufang, who has endured catastrophic emotional and physical trauma, remains the one and only fiancé officially recognized and chosen by myself, Jian Shijie, the top-tier corporate legal division of the Jian Group. Alongside my elite personal legal squad, has already successfully compiled airtight forensic evidence, and we are officially launching ruthless criminal and civil lawsuits against every single perpetrator involved. We will show absolutely zero mercy. The moment that nuclear statement dropped, the entire internet erupted into utter chaos and widespread shock. An absolute army of toxic trolls who were just brutally doxing and harassing me were instantly left stunned, as the narrative completely flipped overnight, with the powerful CEO Jian Shijie entering the chat herself, wielding such an unyielding, terrifying level of authority, and completely cutting ties with Qin Huan on a public stage. The writing on the wall was blindingly clear, leaving absolutely no room for doubt. But right now, Jian Shijie had zero time or energy to monitor the catastrophic digital storm brewing back home. Seated on the express passenger train speeding toward Montreal, her phone violently buzzed with an international call from her father. Her father's voice sounded incredibly frail, broken, and ancient over the receiver, laced with a heavy, congested rasp, making it blindingly obvious he had been weeping uncontrollably. Shijie, we finally read that awful post Huan published, and we saw your official corporate declaration too. That boy, is it truly the reality that he was systematically fabricating everything? The freezing ice locker incident, the car crash, and all those horrific physical injuries. Did he seriously inflict them onto himself? Uncle Jian Shijie abruptly cut him off mid-sentence, her tone equally weighed down by pure soul-crushing exhaustion, yet burning with an absolute undeniable conviction. Mufang has never harmed a single hair on that boy's head, not even once. Every single incident was a calculated, psychotic performance masterminded by Qin Huan. Every single one of us was completely playing right into his hands, our eyes thoroughly blinded by our own toxic unconditional favoritism. Through the tiny speaker of the receiver, her mother's suppressed agonizing wails came crashing through the line, accompanied by the heavy, ragged breathing of her shattered father. Then, all those horrific, unforgivable things we forced Mufang to endure, locking the poor boy away like an animal and making him take the fall for a crime he didn't commit? Her mother choked out through a violent flood of tears. Just how completely broken must he have felt back then? He was already severely injured and bleeding as we are absolute monsters, not human beings. Shiji, you absolutely must track down Mufeng no matter what it takes. You tell him that his mother and father finally realized the horrific mistakes they made, that we were completely out of our minds, and that we are deeply, profoundly sorry for ruining his life. Please beg him to come back home to us, Yao. We will spend every single second of our remaining lives making it up to him, showering him with double the love and care he deserved. Oh. Uncle Auntie, do you honestly think he even has a home to return to anymore? The hysterical wailing on the other end of the line was cut instantly short, leaving behind nothing but a suffocating, deathly silence. After an agonizingly long time, her father's hoarse, shattered voice echoed through the receiver, dripping with absolute, boundless regret. We are the monsters who completely destroyed his home. Disconnecting the call, Jan Shiji leaned her heavily fatigued head against the freezing train window and slowly closed her bloodshot eyes. Late autumn had officially brutally conquered Montreal, blanketing the pavement with a thick carpet of dead sycamore leaves. It was right here that Jian Shijie initiated an even more exhausting, seemingly hopeless manhunt. Because the local Chinese population is remarkably scarce in Montreal's French-speaking sectors, tracking anyone down was an absolute logistical nightmare. She literally pushed herself to run through every single Asian enclave, traditional Chinese restaurant, grocery market, and local language institution across the city, clutching my digital photograph in her trembling hands, as she utilized a clumsy mix of broken French and frantic English, begging over and over again. Please, have you crossed paths with this man? He's incredibly frail, standing roughly about this tall, and he has the most beautiful, striking eyes. The overwhelming majority of responses were just polite, sympathetic shakes of the head. A full grueling month flashed by in the blink of an eye, and she had practically walked through every hidden alleyway and major avenue in Montreal. She had lost a massive amount of weight, becoming visibly skeletal. With deep purple shadows anchored beneath her eyes, her designer clothes heavily wrinkled, and her expensive shoes completely caked in urban dust. That once impossibly glamorous frigid and impeccably tailored sole heiress to the massive Jian Empire now looked like a thoroughly broken, devastated wanderer, roaming aimlessly through the alien foreign streets. During this agonizing stretch, my completely distraught biological parents flew out to Canada. For a brief period, the three of them searched like absolute headless chickens. Yet they still came up completely empty-handed. The elderly couple visibly withered away right before her eyes, the very last flicker of hope dying out completely within their souls, as they boarded a flight back to China utterly crushed by boundless guilt and despair. Following the absolute final sub-zero cold front of late autumn, Montreal was suddenly blanketed by its very first heavy snowfall. Fine crystal-like snowflakes danced aggressively through the winter air, landing softly upon Jian Shijie's trembling shoulders, and injecting a bone-chilling frost straight into her core. She stood completely frozen on the massive public square outside the Notre Dame Basilica, staring blankly at the iconic historical fountain standing right in the center of the plaza. The water lines had already been completely shut down for the winter season, leaving the stagnant pool covered in a fragile sheet of jagged ice. And right at that exact breathtaking millisecond, a slender silhouette clad in a cream-white down winter coat and wearing a bright crimson scarf suddenly walked into his field of vision. The familiar figure abruptly entered her line of sight, standing right by the edge of the fountain with his back turned toward her, leaning forward slightly, as if he were gently feeding the local pigeons. The unmistakable contour of that side profile, the painfully sharp, emaciated jawline, and that uniquely serene, quietly melancholic aura, Genshiji's heart in that precise microsecond literally skipped a beat and came to a dead halt. Her blood violently surged straight to her head in a manic rush, and she completely lost all capacity to care about anything else. Forcing her way aggressively through the dense crowd of strangers, she bolted at full speed toward that exact silhouette, summoning every ounce of breath left in her lungs, to scream out in a raw, raspy voice the name she had desperately repeated in her soul millions of times. Mufeng. The figure by the frozen fountain seemed startled by the sudden shout, slowly turning around to face the noise. It was a completely unfamiliar, strange Asian man's face. It wasn't him. Jian Shijie froze in her tracks so violently that she stumbled backward, nearly crashing onto the hard pavement. The heart inside her chest, which had been pounding so furiously just a second ago, felt as if it were being brutally crushed by an invisible, ruthless fist, and then violently hollowed out entirely, leaving behind nothing but a freezing, gaping void. Hope had ignited only to be instantaneously pulverized. This ultimate dizzying freefall from heaven straight into rock-bottom hell completely shattered her resolve, pushing her to the brink of collapse. The strange man, visually unnerved by her unhinged manic state, hurriedly turned away and walked off into the crowd. Jian Shijie stood paralyzed in the exact same spot, as heavy snowflakes blanketed her rigid, frozen body. It was as if she could no longer process the biting cold, nor could she even perceive the bizarre, judgmental stares thrown her way by the passing pedestrians. Later that evening, Jian Shijie stumbled into a dim, low-profile dive bar on the edge of the street. She immediately ordered the strongest, most unrefined whiskey on the shelf, slamming down glass after glass as the raw alcohol violently burned its way down her throat. Yet it did absolutely nothing to warm her freezing, utterly despondent heart. Her vision began to blur into a hazy distortion, and the core memories she had desperately intentionally tried to lock away suddenly began to resurface with agonizing crystal-clear precision. She remembered the timid, walking on eggshells text message I had sent Shijie. "Are you coming home to have dinner tonight? Well, prepared that homemade soup you love so much." Her response back then was a cold, detached, busy. She recalled how I secretly learned to cook her favorite dishes, getting painful searing blisters all over my hands in the process, only to serve it to her with an eager, hopeful smile. She had merely taken one single bite, frowned, and muttered, "It's too salty," before completely discarding her chopsticks, never touching the food again. She remembered me locked away inside that dark, claustrophobic storage room, desperately pounding against the heavy door, weeping and begging for mercy, while she stood right outside watching the entire horror unfold with a cold, detached gaze. She remembered me beaten to a pulp, curled up helplessly on the frozen floor, while she stood atop the grand staircase, ruthlessly ordering cash to be showered over my bleeding body. She remembered me stepping up to take the fall for the crimes of her precious lover, and how she had personally remorselessly escorted me straight into the police station. Jian Shijie collapsed onto the freezing bar counter, letting out a low, pathetic, self-deprecating laugh. The laughter was raspy, broken, and completely hideous to hear, as a violent torrent of tears broke free from her eyes, flowing completely out of control, mixing with the spilled alcohol to form a thoroughly wretched, pathetic mess. Just what kind of monstrous atrocities did I inflict upon him? Yakuno, she muttered to herself, her voice completely shattered into pieces. Suddenly, the smartphone inside her coat pocket began to vibrate aggressively. It buzzed relentlessly for what felt like an eternity, before Jian Shijie numbly, sluggishly fished it out, answering in a slurred, intoxicated tone, "CEO Jian. Oshim onen omain shiniya." Her assistant's voice came crashing through the speaker, brimming with absolute, uncontainable excitement. "We found it. We finally managed to trace Mr. Chin's active social security registration number. There is a live digital paper trail for him right here in Montreal." Jian Shijie's intoxicated, chaotic brain felt as though it had just been injected with an absolute megadosage of adrenaline. She bolted upright instantly, the sheer shock thoroughly snapping her out of her drunken stupor. "Give me the exact details now." He was officially registered for a 3-day part-time gig at an Asian grocery market located in Old Montreal. However, that digital log is already 2 weeks old. The shop owner stated that he abruptly resigned after just 3 days, because his physical health was completely failing him. But the owner explicitly recalled that upon his resignation, Mr. Chin intensely inquired about where he could find a reputable, intensive French language training program, stating he desperately needed to learn the language to secure a stable job in the near future. Following that exact thread, we successfully dug deeper and confirmed that he has officially registered at the Alliance Française Language Center, having already paid the full tuition fee for the upcoming semester. The curriculum is scheduled to officially launch next week. Jian Shijie violently surged to her feet, and because the sudden movement was so aggressive, her vision completely blacked out for a brief second. But she fiercely gripped the edge of the bar counter to steady her shaking body. "Send the exact location of that language center to my phone right this instant." But he locked a desperate white-knuckled grip onto the edge of the bar counter to brace his swaying body. "Text me the exact address of that training facility right this second." "Right now, move." "Understood. I'll ping it to your phone this exact second." The line went dead, and Jian Shijie stared intensely at the location coordinates her assistant had just sent to her screen. That foreign complex string of French street names felt like the most beautiful symphony she had ever heard in her entire life. She frantically wiped the chaotic mess from her face, hurriedly threw down a thick stack of cash, and bolted right out of the bar. The biting sub-zero wind slinging heavy snowflakes smacked her directly in the face. Yet she didn't feel a single ounce of the freezing cold. An absolute wildfire was roaring to life inside her chest. "Mofeng, this time I swear to God I'm going to find you. Just wait for me." The brutal Canadian winter had officially descended upon Montreal with sudden, violent force. Jian Shijie stood stiffly right outside the main entrance of the French language center, having already staked out the area for over a grueling hour. The heavy doors burst open at exactly 5 o'clock p.m., and crowds of students began filing out in small groups. Jian Shijie's heart instantly leaped straight into her throat, as her eyes frantically scanned the sea of faces in a manic frenzy. And then, her eyes finally locked onto me. I was walking at the absolute back of the crowd, clad in a generic plain black-down winter jacket, and wrapped in a worn-out, faded gray scarf that made my already hollow complexion look even more ghostly pale. I had lost a shocking amount of weight, looking completely emaciated, my jawline painfully sharp and protruding. With my head tilted slightly downward, I exchanged a few quiet sentences in low-toned French, with a blonde girl walking right next to me, and then I let out a a very faint, gentle smile. 5 long years ago, I used to smile at her in that exact same manner, completely timid, innocent, and brimming with a cautious, fragile joy. But as time went on, that smile appeared less and less, fading away into absolute obscurity, until finally nothing remained in my eyes but pure soul-crushing exhaustion and dead silence. Her mouth parted slightly to call out, but her throat felt as if it were being brutally suffocated by an anchor, rendering her completely unable to make a single sound. I waved goodbye to my classmate, turning on my heel to walk away in the opposite direction. But at the exact millisecond I turned around, my gaze casually brushed over the sidewalk where she was standing, and completely locked in place. I saw her, our eyes crashed into one another. Yet the look I gave her was entirely flat, hollow, and devoid of emotion, as if I were merely glancing at an irrelevant, lifeless tree on the side of the road, or a completely anonymous stranger passing by. Jian Shiji's heart violently plummeted, sinking straight into a dark, bottomless abyss of ice. Mufeng, she finally salvaged her vocal cords, screaming his name in a horribly raw, raspy voice, as her body instinctively, completely losing control, charged right across the pavement. In a matter of split seconds, she threw herself directly in my path, blocking me. I ground to a halt, halting my stride, and slowly raised my eyes to look at her. "Ma'am, is there something you need?" Mufeng, her entire voice shook and trembled violently. She desperately extended her hand to touch me, but her courage utterly failed her, leaving her fingers frozen midair. "I've been hunting for you for so long. Please just come back home with me, okay?" I stared back at her with absolute unsettling tranquility. Those very eyes that once held nothing but her beautiful image were now completely vacant, dead, and hollow, unable to reflect a single trace of her existence anymore. "Home," I echoed the word back to her. My delivery so entirely flat and casual, it felt as if we were merely discussing the afternoon weather. "Where exactly is this home you speak of?" "Our home," Jian Shijie lunged forward half a step in an absolute manic panic, her words tumbling out in a disorganized, chaotic mess. "Back to our home. I was wrong, Mufeng. I finally see the horrific mistakes I made. I should never have treated you like garbage. I should have trusted you blindly, and I should have never forced you to endure such agonizing, cruel injustice. Let's just go back home, please. I swear on my life, I will treat you right from now on. I will only ever care for you. I will never ever..." She choked, unable to finish her sentence, because I deliberately took a physical step backward, easily dodging her hand that was desperately trying to make contact. It was a minor, subtle adjustment, yet it radiated an absolute, unvarnished aura of deep revulsion and rejection. "Miss Jian," I spoke once again, my words remaining completely sub-zero. "Please behave yourself." Jian Shiji's eyes instantly welled up with thick, scorching tears. Never in her entire life of supreme privilege had she ever been reduced to such a pathetic, wretched state, looking exactly like an abandoned, unwanted child, utterly clueless and paralyzed with panic. Don't call me that, Mufeng. Please, just look at me. It's me, I'm Jian Shijie. Open your eyes and look at me." Fumbling around in a complete frantic panic inside her heavy designer winter coat, she pulled out a neatly, meticulously folded legal document from her inner pocket. It was none other than that official agreement to dissolve our engagement. "I am not signing this trash," her voice spiked in volume, laced with a terrifying hint of obsessive madness. "Look at it, I haven't signed it. Mufeng, our engagement hasn't been dissolved yet. You are still legally my absolute fiancé. Our separation is an absolute unilateral decision. Your consent is completely irrelevant." I cut her off smoothly, my flat tone still showing absolutely zero emotional resonance. "The binding legal paperwork has already been fully processed by my retained attorney. Miss Jian, from a strictly legal standpoint, you and I no longer share any connection whatsoever." "Then I'll just start over and chase you again." Jian Shijie practically screamed as she broke down, desperately clawing at this final, desperate lifeline, her eyes brimming with a deeply pathetic, submissive begging. "Mufeng, please just grant me one single chance. Just one, and I will spend the rest of my entire life making it up to you." "Jian Shijie," I suddenly let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Do you honestly not remember? You used to pursue Qin Huan in this exact pathetic manner back in the day, staking out beneath his dorm building all night long, gifting him lavish bouquets of 99 roses, and begging him, just give me one single chance to be the one who protects you." Every single ounce of color instantaneously drained from Jian Shijie's face, as if the entire volume of blood in her veins had completely frozen solid at that very microsecond. "What's the matter?" The cynical curve of my lips widened slightly, yet the depths of my eyes remained completely frosted over. "The exact same romantic playbook you proudly weaponized to win over Qin Huan. You're seriously recycling it on me now. It's a shame really, because I'm absolutely not buying it." Jian Shiji's mouth fell open, yet she was utterly incapable of forcing a single syllable past her lips. She desperately wanted to fire back, to scream that it wasn't like that at all, but the historical core memories she had meticulously, intentionally tried to bury violently flooded her brain with undeniable, vivid clarity. Yes, back then, Qin Huan had whined that even though their families were arranged to be married, He had never actually experienced the thrill of being pursued by her. Because she spoiled and pampered him entirely to a fault, she eagerly agreed to court him. She had waited outside his dorm with flowers whispering every sweet romantic line imaginable. In those days, she genuinely believed that was the epitome of true love, the most raw, authentic impulse of youthful passion. But right now, hearing those exact same historical details weaponized from the mouth of Qin Mufeng, it transformed into the most toxic, venomous irony imaginable. Jian Shiji, I don't love you anymore. I paused for a brief second, feeling as though that statement wasn't entirely accurate, before casually adding, actually let me rephrase that. To be precise, I have completely lost the capacity to love altogether. My entire ability to feel affection for another human being, you systematically, piece by piece, crushed it into absolute dust. I raised my hand, gently tapping the exact center of my own chest. Everything in here is completely dead. It died the exact moment you systematically forced the abortion of my unborn child. It died when you ruthlessly locked me away inside that freezing, pitch-black claustrophobic storage unit. And it died when you stood by and authorized your thugs to brutally break my bones with clubs. Back when you ruthlessly ordered your goons to beat me down with wooden baseball bats, it died completely the exact moment you personally escorted me to the police station, forcing me to take the fall for the monstrous actions of your precious lover. It's fully dead and entirely rotted away. Every single syllable I uttered directly triggered a horrific flashback, unleashing an entirely new layer of emotional trauma, and tearing open a permanent, unhealable psychological scar. Thus, as I watched her entire countenance instantly turn a ghostly, petrified white, I calmly delivered the final verdict: stop wasting your energy. Just crawl back home and spend the rest of your days with your precious Qin Huan. You two toxic individuals actually deserve each other. The moment the words left my lips, I completely cut her off from my gaze, stepping right around her stiff body to walk directly ahead. Jian Shiji was violently jolted awake from her profound state of paralyzing panic and absolute despair. She spun around, charging forward in a manic burst of desperation, and locked me into a suffocating, unbreakable embrace from behind. I won't let go. She buried her tear-streaked face directly into my upper back, her voice completely choked up with heavy, violent sobs, as scorching hot tears instantly soaked straight through the fabric of my scarf. I am absolutely not leaving you, Mufanga. Without you in my life, there is absolutely no home for me to return to. I have nowhere else in this entire world to go. I instinctively began to struggle, exerting all my physical strength to pry her arms off me. Unhand me. I can't let go, because I know damn well if I let go right now, you will vanish from my life forever. Jian Shiji tightened her suffocating, desperate grip even further, her frantic words tumbling out in a chaotic, unstructured mess, degrading herself into the absolute dirt. Mufeng, I am consumed by absolute agonizing regret. I truly, genuinely understand the horrific sins I committed. It's fine if you absolutely despise me, or if you hold a lifelong venomous grudge against my entire existence. You can beat me, curse me, or literally execute me right here. Anything is fine. Just please don't throw me away. I am begging you on my knees, don't abandon me. Jian Shiji. I instantly ceased all my physical struggling, my voice dropping to a sub-zero temperature that could literally form icicles in the air. You look absolutely pathetic right now. Jian Shiji's entire physical form suffered a violent, agonizing tremor, and the desperate pressure of her locked arms loosened for a mere fraction of a second. I'd capitalized on that precise window of opportunity, and digit by digit, forcefully pried open her tightly interlaced, clawing fingers. My hands were completely deathly freezing to the touch, and the moment they brushed against her uncomfortably scorching, feverish skin, it caused her entire body to suffer an involuntary, violent shudder. Do not take another single step behind me. I spun around to face her directly, staring straight through her soul with eyes that held absolutely zero warmth. If you dare follow me, I will immediately contact the local authorities. Without wasting another single microsecond of my life looking at her, I quickened my pace, walking directly toward a beat-up old vehicle parked by the curb. The driver's side door immediately swung wide open. A young, elegant woman clad in a sleek beige trench coat stepped out of the vehicle, looking at me with a wave of deep concern. She asked me in fluent Chinese, "Are you all right just now?" I merely shook my head in a calm response, pulling open the passenger door and sliding right inside. "I'm perfectly fine. She's just a completely irrelevant stranger. Let's get out of here." The woman glanced over at Jian Shiji, who was standing frozen in the heavy snow, but chose not to pry any further. She got into the driver's seat, fired up the ignition, and the car immediately sped away, leaving nothing but a cloud of exhaust. Jian Shiji stood rooted to the absolute spot, entirely motionless, looking exactly like a broken, abandoned monument stranded in a wasteland of ice. The winter storm raged on relentlessly, snowflakes dancing aggressively before settling upon her trembling shoulders, rapidly coating her hair in a thin, pale shroud of white. She stared blankly toward the exact direction where the car had vanished, gazing intensely at that utterly vacant, desolate intersection. The precise location where her heart used to beat felt as though it had been violently ripped out and dragged away along with that vehicle. leaving behind nothing but a gaping hollow crater through which the biting Arctic wind howled. But Jian Shiji absolutely refused to give up. Like an obsessive, lingering wraith, she began to silently embed herself into the fabric of my daily life here in Montreal. The high-priced private investigators she retained were ruthlessly efficient, rapidly unearthing the exact coordinates of my residential address, the third floor of a dilapidated centuries-old apartment complex in Old Montreal. The natural sunlight was practically non-existent, and the stairwells were suffocatingly narrow. But the monthly rent was incredibly cheap. She didn't dare cross the threshold or step inside, terrified that I would genuinely follow through on my threat to call the police, and even more petrified of witnessing an even deeper wave of pure revulsion in my eyes. She only had the courage to stake out across the street, hiding herself away in an obscure low-profile corner just to watch me from afar. She watched me emerge from the building every morning at exactly 7 a.m., wrapping my cheap down jacket tightly around myself as I trekked toward the subway station. My complexion remained entirely ghost-like and pale, yet my stride was incredibly steady and determined. She watched me return from my language classes late in the afternoon, stopping by the convenience store downstairs to purchase the absolute cheapest loaf of toast and a carton of generic milk. Whenever a scruffy stray cat timidly approached me, I would instinctively crouch down on the snow-covered ground, pinch off a small fragment of bread from my grocery bag, and gently place it on the pavement before me. As I patiently watched the stray devour the food, a faint, barely perceptible trace of a warm smile would tug at the corners of my lips. Jian Shiji would greedily, desperately feast her eyes on that beautiful smile, as her own heart violently spasmed and tightened with unbearable agony. How long had it been since she last witnessed me smiling so peacefully? She also kept noticing that same woman who drove the beat-up car, frequently escorting me back to my apartment complex. Sometimes they arrived in that weathered vehicle, and other times they simply walked side by side. The two of them would linger downstairs beneath the apartment building chatting, and the woman would tilt her head slightly upward, listening to my every word with absolute undivided attention, before nodding her head and letting out a gentle, radiant smile. Her gaze was incredibly tender, a specific look that Jian Shiji recognized all too well. It was the exact unmistakable way a woman stares at the man she deeply truly loves. The sight acted like a venomous viper ruthlessly gnawing away at her internal organs. Eventually, she discovered that the woman's name was Zhou Xinyun, an instructor at the French Language Training Center. She was a Chinese national who had relocated to Montreal a few years before me, and she went completely out of her way to look after my well-being. I had also secured a part-time job at a local neighborhood cafe. Jian Shiji naturally tracked down the exact establishment. It was tiny, minimally decorated, and had a rather sparse crowd of regular customers. Every single afternoon, she would show up, order the most expensive coffee on the menu, and isolate herself in the furthest, most obscure corner table, remaining completely stationary for hours on end just to watch me. Clad in a standard barista's apron, I worked efficiently wiping down tables with practiced ease, taking orders and serving hot beverages to the clientele. Whenever customers attempted to flirt or deliberately make things difficult for me, I always managed to gracefully, silently deflect their unwanted advances, maintaining a perfectly polite yet thoroughly detached professional smile. Until one day, a heavily intoxicated male customer began aggressively picking a fight with me, spewing vile, highly inappropriate insults in my direction. The store manager rushed over upon hearing the loud commotion, but instead of defusing the situation or defending me, he viciously reprimanded me for being difficult and offending a paying customer. Jian Shiji completely snapped right then and there. She surged to her feet, marched straight over to the counter, viciously grabbed the aggressive drunkard by his wrist, and twisted it back with brutal force, shoving him away as he let out a pathetic howl of pure agony. Then turning her gaze toward the store manager, she delivered a sub-zero terrifying glare. "I'm buying this entire establishment right now. So pack your things and get the hell out of my sight this instant." The manager was thoroughly paralyzed by her terrifying murderous aura, and noting her incredibly expensive high-end designer attire, he didn't dare utter a single syllable of protest, slinking away in absolute humiliation. Yet I didn't give her a single glance, turning on my heel to walk straight into the back kitchen. Jian Shiji immediately chased after me, trapping me inside the suffocating narrow corridor. "Mufang, stop working in a miserable place like this. It's far too exhausting, and those toxic people." "Jian Shiji," I cut her off instantly, my voice chillingly flat and completely unbothered. "Stop meddling in my life." "I'm not trying to meddle. I just can't stand seeing you suffer any more injustice," Jian Shiji pleaded in a frantic, desperate rush. I slowly shifted my gaze to look her dead in the eye, those pupils of mine still entirely devoid of any human emotion. "Wasn't every single bit of my agonizing injustice served to me directly by your hands? What's the point of playing the saintly savior now?" Jian Shiji was utterly paralyzed on the spot by my venomous retort, her entire face turning a ghostly petrified white. "Furthermore, pack up your pathetic little routine. You just impulsively bought out this entire cafe?" What's next on your agenda? Buying out my language center. Or perhaps purchasing the rundown apartment complex I sleep in? Jian Shijie, your endless millions. And your absolute corporate power don't mean a single damn thing to me. The moment the words left my mouth, I sidestepped her frozen body to resume my duties. The very next day, when Jian Shijie returned to the cafe, I was completely gone. The manager sheepishly informed her that I had officially resigned. Standing all alone in the center of that vacant, hollow cafe, she was crushed by a profound, agonizing wave of absolute helplessness for the first time in her life. Her limitless wealth, her supreme authority. Everything she once proudly believed could solve any problem in the universe had become nothing more than a pathetic, laughable, and entirely useless joke. When leveled against me, I didn't want a single cent of it. In fact, I utterly despised its very existence. Left with no other option, she was forced back into the shadows as a pathetic stalker, quietly monitoring the outer fringes of my daily existence from afar. But on one particular afternoon, as she watched me wiping down a table, my entire physical form suddenly suffered a violent, unstable wobble. My hand white-knuckled the edge of the wood to steady myself, and I kept my head buried low, completely paralyzed for a long time. Her chest violently tightened with pure panic. Just as she bolted up to intervene, she saw me force my rigid body upright, my complexion looking infinitely paler than a blank sheet of paper, while beads of cold, agonizing sweat saturated my forehead. She completely lost all of her remaining self-control, sprinting across the floor in a few frantic strides to violently stabilize my collapsing frame. Mufeng! The moment her skin made contact, she gasped at the radiating waves of heat. My body was violently burning up with a fever, and it was escalating at a terrifyingly dangerous critical rate. Jian Shiji completely lost her mind with absolute panic, frenetically reaching out her other hand to press against my burning forehead. You're burning up at a terrifyingly dangerous level. You have a massive fever right now. I'm taking you to the emergency room immediately. I desperately wanted to shove her away, but my depleted muscles possessed absolutely zero physical strength. I don't need your hypocritical concern. This time, you are absolutely going to listen to me. Jian Shijie exhibited a rare streak of raw dominance, practically dragging my frail frame by force, as she marched directly out of the building, sprinting past the thoroughly stunned, jaw-dropping manager. She barked out a final command: he officially resigns from this dumpster fire. Then, completely ignoring my incredibly weak, pathetic attempts to resist, she forcefully shoved me into the passenger seat and sped straight toward the hospital. Inside the medical center, the stinging, sterile stench of chemical disinfectant was utterly suffocating. The examining physician's brow furrowed into a tight, incredibly grim knot after running the diagnostics. He's running a severe high fever of 39 degrees Celsius. His chronic inflammation has aggressively flared up alongside an active internal infection. He's suffering from extreme severe malnutrition, acute anemia, and a dangerous case of mild pneumonia. He requires immediate mandatory hospitalization for intensive treatment. Jian Shijie's heart continuously plummeted into a dark, freezing abyss. She frantically finalized all the admission paperwork and stationed herself at my bedside, gazing down at my ghostly, pale, incredibly fragile sleeping face, as a violent wave of self-loathing made her want to claw her own skin off. How on earth did I manage to survive through such agonizing hell all by myself? By the time my heavy eyelids finally fluttered open, the sky outside the glass window had already dissolved into pitch-black darkness. I blinked my dry eyes a few times to adjust to the harsh, bright fluorescent lighting. And that's when I spotted Jian Shijie, who was still faithfully guarding the edge of my mattress. She looked thoroughly exhausted and absolutely wrecked herself, dark, unkempt stubble aggressively breaking through her jawline, and thick, heavy shadows staining the undersides of her eyes. She was staring down at me without even blinking once. The moment our gazes violently collided, I was the first to abruptly sever the connection, shifting my eyes back to the blank ceiling. My voice was incredibly raspy and hollow. Just leave. Jian Shijie's eyes instantaneously turned a vibrant, tearful red. She desperately grabbed my hand that was resting outside the thick blanket, a hand that felt completely deathly freezing to the touch. She squeezed it with everything she had, frantically attempting to channel her own body heat into my numb fingers. I'm not going anywhere. Mufeng, it's perfectly fine if you absolutely despise me or hold a venomous grudge against my soul, but I will never stand by and watch you survive all by yourself, in this miserable, agonizing state of suffering ever again. Whether I survive or drop dead, I weakly attempted to wrench my fingers free from her grasp. But her desperate grip was far too unyielding and tight, forcing me to completely abandon the physical effort. Instead, my voice merely dropped to an even more sub-zero, vicious tone. Has absolutely nothing to do with you anymore. It has everything to do with me. Jian Shiji stared at me with stubborn intensity, emphasizing every single syllable, as if she were channeling every single ounce of her remaining physical strength. Qin Mufeng, for the rest of my entire life, whether in life or in death, my existence will always be bound to yours. I let out a weary, exhausted sigh and closed my eyes, completely refusing to utter another word, and refusing to look at her ever again. Jian Shiji felt a suffocating, agonizing pain flare up in her chest. Yet all she could do was desperately hold on to my freezing hand, remaining completely stationary as she watched over me. The arrival of Zhou Xinyan was the only thing that shattered the heavy, paralyzing atmosphere. Cradling a bouquet of vibrant, cheerful sunflowers in her arms, she gently pushed open the clinic door. Instantly freezing for a fraction of a second upon spotting Jian Shijie immediately shifted into a highly defensive, hostile state, behaving exactly like a vicious apex predator guarding its personal territory. As she locked a sharp, murderous glare onto the woman standing at the doorway, Zhou Xinyan merely knit her brows in a slight frown, her observant gaze tracking downward to rest directly on Jian Shijie's fingers, which were still tightly, desperately clutching my hand. "I happen to be his official fiancé," Jian Shijie stated as she rose to her feet, deliberately positioning her body to block Zhou Xinyan's line of sight toward me, her delivery cold, rigid, and unyielding. Upon hearing those ridiculous words, Zhou Xinyan actually let out a soft chuckle, her expression carrying a clear sense of understanding blended with a faint touch of mockery. "His fiancé? That's quite strange because Mufeng explicitly informed me that he is currently 100% single, has absolutely no romantic partner, and certainly doesn't possess a fiancé." Jian Shijie's countenance instantly darkened, and just as she was about to fiercely fire back, my incredibly faint yet crystal clear voice echoed from the hospital mattress. "Xinyan, you're finally here. Please come on inside." Zhou Xinyan softly acknowledged my request, completely bypassing the visibly rigid, trembling frame of Jian Shijie as she glided directly over to my bedside and gracefully arranged the sunflowers into the glass vase resting on the nightstand. Her tone was exceptionally tender. "Are you feeling a bit better now?" "What exactly did the attending physician say?" "I'm feeling much better. It's just my usual chronic flare-up of fever." My vocal delivery softened significantly as I spoke to her. "That's a massive relief. I actually prepared some homemade congee for you, so you really need to force yourself to eat at least a few spoonfuls." Zhou Xinyan chatted warmly as she unlatched her insulated thermal container, and an organic, comfortable aura of domestic familiarity effortlessly flowed between the two of us. Jian Shijie was left standing there like a complete, absolute outsider, entirely isolated from our private world. She desperately wanted to force her way into the conversation, but the very moment she stepped forward, I finally spoke up. I locked my eyes on her and delivered a harsh command, "Get out." My tone was entirely flat yet laced with absolute unyielding authority. Jian Shijie's entire body instantly froze, right at the threshold of the room, forced to watch as Zhou Xinyan tenderly helped me sit upright, carefully adjusting the pillows behind my frail back. She then unlatched the thermal container, scooped up a spoonful of hot congee, and gently blew on it to cool it down before offering it to my lips. And this time, I didn't offer a single shred of resistance. Jian Shijie stood completely alone outside the closed door, her trembling spine leaning against the freezing, sterile hallway wall, listening to the faint, gentle sound of Zhou Xinyan's laughter radiating from within. A toxic wave of pure jealousy erupted like a wildfire, incinerating her remaining sanity and threatening to completely consume her whole being. Yet she didn't even possess the basic right to push that door open and step inside. Throughout the entire duration of my hospitalization, Jian Shijie practically structured her life around my bedside, refusing to leave. She had never coddled or taken care of another human being in her entire life, but now she approached the task with an incredibly clumsy yet dead serious dedication. She even placed international calls back to China, demanding her private family chefs give her step-by-step culinary guidance. Trapped inside the cramped, suffocating kitchen of her temporary apartment, she attempted to brew a nourishing broth for the very first time. She completely botched the water ratio, accidentally dumped in a massive excess of salt, and painful, angry blisters erupted all over her skin from the spitting hot oil. The final product she eventually presented at my bedside was a bowl of incredibly unappetizing, murky-looking, and taste-wise utterly disastrous medicinal soup. I merely cast a brief, detached glance at it, offering zero commentary and absolutely refusing to take a single sip. She silently carried the bowl away and dumped it down the drain, only to repeat the entire agonizing process the very next day. Whenever I suffered a violent coughing fit in the dead of night, she would instantaneously bolt awake from her light sleep, creeping over with absolute stealth to gently hoist my torso upward. She would softly pat my back and offer me warm water, and when the hacking became so severe that my body curled into a fetal position, my skeletal shoulders looked so fragile it was practically heartbreaking, Jian Shijie would carefully wrap her arms around my trembling frame, offering a crude, desperate attempt at comfort. I never once acknowledged her presence, nor did I actively fight back against her touch, behaving exactly like a hollow, soulless ragdoll. Whatever food Jian Shijie placed before me, I would mindlessly consume, and whatever task she performed around me, I didn't bother to obstruct. Yet my eyes remained completely vacant and dead, staring right through her silhouette into an absolute abyss. This chilling indifference was infinitely worse than outright hatred or aggressive defiance. It sent a far more terrifying wave of pure panic through Jian Shijie's entire soul, until that fateful day, when Qin Huaan's incoming call violently disrupted the silence once again. The smartphone violently vibrated on top of the wooden nightstand, the screen illuminating to flash that deeply detestable familiar name. Jen Shijie cast a cautious glance at me as I rested peacefully with my eyes closed on the hospital mattress, before snatching the phone and stepping directly out into the corridor to pick up the call. Xin Huaan's piercing absolute train wreck of a voice instantly erupted. Shijie, you have to save me. My parents completely disowned me and kicked me out of the Qin estate. They've entirely abandoned me. My severe depression is aggressively flaring up again. I'm suffering so incredibly much. And I honestly don't want to live anymore. Where on earth are you? Can you please come back home and see me just this once? I genuinely cannot survive another day like this. If this were the past. The moment she heard him letting out such a pathetic, miserable sob story, Jian Shijie's heart would have instantly softened, and she would have immediately booked the absolute earliest flight back to his side. But now, as that overly familiar voice echoed in her ear, Jian Shijie felt absolutely nothing but a wave of sub-zero pure disgust and sheer irritation. Qin Huaan, her voice cut through the line like an icicle, entirely devoid of any human warmth. If you desperately want to die, go do it as far away from me as possible. And stop contaminating my ears with your pathetic voice. The frantic wailing on the other end of the line instantaneously screeched to a halt, leaving behind nothing but heavy, ragged, and thoroughly unhinged gasps of disbelief. Shiji, how could you ever say something so incredibly cruel to me? Qin Huaan's voice aggressively escalated into a manic shriek. Qin Huaan, you listen to me very carefully. Jian Shijie explicitly cut him off, enunciating every single syllable with lethal clarity. Whether your so-called clinical depression is a complete scam or a reality is something you and I both know damn well. Do you honestly need me to forward your fraudulent medical certificates and the private audio recordings of your consulting physician directly to your inbox, just to refresh your selective memory? Furthermore, from this exact second onward, never dare to dial my number again. And absolutely never attempt to harass Mufang ever again. Otherwise, I won't hesitate to deploy every single corporate and legal asset at my disposal to ensure you rot behind bars where you can thoroughly reflect on your sins. Consider yourself warned. The moment the words left her lips, she ruthlessly severed the connection with a sharp tap and permanently blocked the contact from her phone. Having finalized all of this, she exhaled a long, heavy breath of pent-up toxic tension, turning around to head back inside the medical suite, only to instantaneously freeze dead in her tracks. The door to the hospital room had somehow cracked open, leaving a narrow, gaping slit, and I had silently awoken standing right on the other side. I was merely leaning back against the headboard, quietly tracking her every move. Jian Shijie's heart instantly tightened into a knot, an inexplicable wave of raw panic washing over her. She rapidly bolted back into the private medical suite. Mufeng, there's absolutely no need, I flatly cut her off, shifting my gaze away to look back out the window at the bleak landscape. It was those same soul-crushing words yet again. Jian Shijie felt every single desperate explanation die instantly in the back of her throat. She stood rooted to the spot in complete hopeless defeat, watching me regress completely back into that chilling, utterly unapproachable shell of absolute isolation, leaving her heart feeling completely hollowed out yet agonizingly heavy. A few days later, I was officially discharged from the hospital. Jian Shijie aggressively insisted on driving me back to my rundown apartment complex, and I didn't bother to fight her on it. The high-end vehicle eventually screeched to a halt beneath the centuries-old complex, and Jian Shijie instantly hopped out, rushing to the other side to carefully assist me. But I simply unlatched the passenger door myself and stepped out onto the pavement. Dusk was rapidly settling over the city, and the streetlights were just beginning to flicker to life, casting a dim, sickly yellow glow over the snow-covered street. Right at that exact critical second, a shady individual, clad in a pitch-black face mask and a low-profile beanie, ambushed us, launching himself out from the shadows of an obscure alleyway. His hand tightly gripped a lethal, glinting tactical dagger, and he lunged forward, aiming the cold steel directly at my vital organs. The entire sequence unfolded at breakneck speed, leaving me absolutely zero time to even process the threat. Watch out. Jian Shijie's pupils violently dilated to the size of pinpricks, her mind instantly going completely blank. Yet, her physical reflexes moved light years faster than her thoughts. Driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct, she violently pivoted her torso, using her own frame to forcefully shield me entirely within her embrace, deliberately exposing her own bare back to the trajectory of that incoming blade. The sickening, muffled squelch of sharp steel tearing into human flesh echoed with terrifying clarity. Jian Shijie's entire body suffered a violent spastic tremor as she let out a choked groan, yet she only squeezed the fragile man trapped in her arms infinitely tighter. The masked assailant, having successfully landed a critical strike, prepared to plunge the blade again. But a group of young locals walking nearby witnessed the brutal assault. With furious roars, they aggressively charged into the fray, tackling the attacker to the concrete and pinning his limbs down by force. Jian Shijie felt a localized, agonizing explosion of pain erupting across her back, as a warm, thick crimson fluid rapidly saturated the fabric of her coat. She painstakingly tilted her chin up to look at me, her voice violently trembling from the sheer trauma of the wound, yet laced with a strange, almost unbelievable sense of pure relief. Mufeng, are you unharmed? I was left completely pinned against Jian Shijie's trembling chest, my nostrils instantaneously overwhelmed by the thick metallic stench of fresh blood. I cast my eyes downward, meeting Jian Shijie's face hovering mere inches from mine. Her skin had turned completely and utterly as pale as a ghost, beads of cold sweat rapidly saturating her entire forehead. Yet the intense gaze she locked onto me shone with a terrifying, blinding brilliance, brimming with a desperate panic and lingering horror over almost losing me forever. I forcefully shoved her away from my body, my physical movements lacking even a shred of gentleness. Jian Shiji stumbled back unsteadily, barely managing to keep her balance, as the movement violently wrenched and tore at the open gash on her back, forcing her to sharply inhale a breath of freezing air from the agonizing pain, while a fresh torrent of crimson fluid aggressively welled out. I pulled out my smartphone and dialed the emergency services, my vocal delivery sounding so chillingly calm it was practically unnatural, as I explicitly provided the dispatcher with our coordinates and the severity of the attack. Next, I marched directly over to the pinned down assailant, casting a brief glance at his face, my expression completely blank and devoid of any human emotion, before casually walking back over to Jian Shijie's side. Jian Shijie's back scraped against the car door as she slowly collapsed onto the concrete. The massive loss of blood was already causing her vision to blur into darkness, yet she desperately forced her heavy eyelids open just to keep tracking me. Mufeng, she painstakingly extended a hand trying to grasp the hem of my jacket, but her fingers lost all remaining power, and limply fell to her side. I stared down at her from my towering position, watching the thick dark blood continuously pool out from beneath her body, staining the icy concrete surface a vibrant red. My lips twitched slightly for a fraction of a second, but in the end I chose to say absolutely nothing. The piercing wailing sirens of the incoming ambulance rapidly shattered the distant silence, even as the paramedics lifted Jian Shijie onto the rigid transport stretcher. Her fading vision remained fiercely glued in my exact direction, clinging to my silhouette until her consciousness was entirely swallowed by absolute darkness. Outside the sterile operating room, the warning light glowed a continuous ominous red. I sat perfectly still on the hard plastic bench lining the corridor, my clothes still severely contaminated with smears of Jian Shijie's fresh blood. My facial expression remained completely dead and unreadable. Suddenly, the frantic, echoey thudding of rapid footsteps resonated down the hallway. My father and mother finally arrived at the scene in a breathless rush, both of them wearing expressions of absolute terror and panic, their high-end wardrobe completely disheveled and messy. It was crystal clear they had bolted the second that they received the horrific notification. Their scanning eyes instantaneously locked onto my figure sitting alone on the bench. Mufeng, my mother let out an emotional shriek as she lunged toward my frame, tears violently erupting from her eyes in an instant. My precious son, are you all right? You nearly scared your mother to death. She frantically reached out her arms to embrace me, but I coldly pivoted my torso away, completely dodging her touch. My mother's trembling hands froze midair, and the frantic expression on her face instantaneously petrified into stone. I slowly raised my eyelids indifferently, scanning my calm gaze over their faces. My voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotional cadence, I am completely unharmed. The person who actually sustained a lethal wound is Jian Shijie, and the medical team is currently inside performing emergency resuscitation. My father stared helplessly at his son's chillingly detached and completely estranged demeanor, tears of absolute agony spilling over and rolling down his face. He took a frantic step toward me, his vocal cords trembling violently. Mufeng, your dad finally understands just how much agonizing injustice you've suffered. Dad was completely wrong, but I should have never treated you with such utter cruelty. Please, can you just come back home with your dad? We will absolutely spend the rest of our lives making it up to you, and shower you with double the amount of love and care. The corners of my lips twitched slightly into a faint smirk, but that smile carried absolutely zero warmth. Mr. Chin and Mrs. Chin, if my memory serves me correctly, my biological parents. On the exact day I signed that legally binding document severing, our entire familial relationship already ceased to exist in this world. My father and mother felt as if they had been struck by a lethal bolt of lightning, their complexions instantly turning a ghostly, petrified white. With a heavy thud, my mother collapsed onto her knees right on the floor, viciously wrapping her arms around my legs as she wailed in a heart-wrenching, agonizing sob. Mufeng, your mother was wrong. Your mom truly deeply realizes her horrific mistakes now. It was your mother who was incredibly foolish. It was your mother whose mind was completely blinded and manipulated by that snake. Please, I beg of you, forgive your mother, and just come back home with your mom, slut. From now on, I will absolutely protect and cherish you with my entire life. Please, just look at your mother. I cast my eyes downward, watching the sobbing woman groveling at my feet, her face completely drenched in a chaotic mess of tears. This elegant, high society noblewoman who once considered even a passing glance at me to be an utter waste of her precious time was now completely disheveled and broken beyond recognition, looking exactly like an unhinged madwoman. Yet my heart did not experience a single ripple of emotion, remaining trapped in a state of absolute sub-zero numbness. Mrs. Kin, one by one, I began to pry her tightly clutching fingers off the fabric of my trousers. My physical movements, agonizingly slow yet completely unyielding, kindly maintain your dignity. Witnessing this absolute rejection, my father, likewise, dropped heavily to his knees, preparing to aggressively kowtow and slam his forehead onto the tiles before me. Mufeng, your dad will bow and beg for your mercy. Your dad behaved like an absolute monster. Your dad has failed you so unforgivably. Please just find it in your heart to forgive your father and mother. Your father is literally begging you. Before his forehead could slam into the linoleum tiles, I violently bolted to my feet, completely evading his pathetic display. I stared down at my groveling biological parents, my gaze remaining entirely flat and unwavering, harboring nothing but a faint chilling touch of absolute mockery. What on earth do you think you are doing right now? My voice was incredibly soft, yet it echoed with crystal clear precision directly into their ears. In the past, you used cheap familial bonds to emotionally blackmail me, and now you're trying to use your pathetic guilt to hold me hostage again. My mother and father sharply hoisted their heads up, staring at me in utter breathless shock. 5 long years ago, you dragged me back into the Grand Chin estate. Claiming you owed me the world and wanted to make it up to me, I calmly enunciated, speaking as if I were merely narrating a tragic story about a complete stranger. Throughout those 5 years, what exactly did you do to make it up to me? Was it forcing me to surrender the bedroom I had barely occupied for a single month, just to hand it over to your precious, pampered, adopted son Chinhua Andosh? Was it ensuring that on the exact day of my own birthday, I was completely abandoned at the hotel banquet by my own fiancé, left to sit all alone until the dead of night? Was it allowing Shiji to ruthlessly abort my unborn child, simply because keeping it would make your beloved adopted son feel sad? Was it throwing me into that freezing pitch-black storage room, leaving me to burn up from a massive fever until I was practically on the brink of death? Was it forcing me to take the fall for your precious adopted son's criminal behavior, personally dragging me to the police station to ensure I had a permanent criminal record? Or was it standing by idly while I was brutally lynched by a mob of strangers, left clinging to life on a hospital bed while you completely ignored my existence? With every single horrific memory I vocalize, my father and mother's complexions turned a shade whiter, their entire bodies trembling with a far more violent, uncontrollable shudder. Those dark, abusive atrocities they had so deliberately swept under the rug and brushed off as minor, insignificant incidents of the past were now being brutally laid bare before them, dripping in raw truth. Every single instance, every single sickening act, transformed into a lethal solid iron nail pinning their absolute guilt to the cross. You repeatedly claimed that I am your own flesh and blood. I let out a soft chuckle, and as that hollow laughter rippled out, hot heavy tears unexpectedly spilled over from my eyes, tracing a burning path down my freezing pale cheeks. But over the course of these 5 miserable years, did you ever grant me even a single solitary fraction of the genuine, unconditional love that biological parents are supposed to give? Absolutely not. I immediately answered my own question, my vocal cords choking up yet remaining piercingly clear. You people were merely performing the mandatory social obligation of bringing back a lost heir. Your supposed affection, your synthetic concern, and your grotesque, deeply rooted favoritism were lavished entirely upon Qinhuan. And now that you finally uncovered that he isn't your biological child, now that you realize he's been playing you like a fiddle all along, now that you recognize your horrific sins and regret everything, so what? I looked down at them, my tears spilling over completely out of control. Yet my voice cut through the air as sharp and biting as absolute sub-zero ice. So does that mean I'm supposed to feel completely overwhelmed with gratitude? Am I supposed to magically erase every single trauma you inflicted on me, pack up my things to head back to that grand mansion, and willingly step back into the role of that tragic, disposable biological son whom you can relentlessly sacrifice at your whim? It is way too damn late today. I violently raised my hand to forcefully wipe the tears streaming down my face. Yet fresh burning tears instantly welled up to take their place. From the absolute exact second you chose to believe his toxic lies, and threw my life away like garbage, you completely revoked your right to ever call yourselves my parents. That signed legal document severing our ties was never a petty outburst of rage. It was the absolute final shred of basic dignity I granted to you, and the ultimate boundary I drew to salvage my own shattered soul. From this day forward, I have absolutely zero connection to the Chin family name. I am begging you to permanently stay the hell out of my life. The moment the words left my lips, I refused to grant them a single passing glance. I pivoted sharply on my heel and walked directly toward the emergency stairwell. Mufeng! My mother let out a blood-curdling, desperate shriek of absolute agony. scrambling to pursue me, but her knees completely buckled, leaving her paralyzed on the floor. My father sat entirely paralyzed on the cold tiles, burying his face in his trembling hands as he let out the hollow, suffocating wails of a cornered beast, his broad shoulders violently shuddering from the sheer weight of his despair. Without a single backwards glance, I descended the concrete stairs step by agonizing step, the rhythmic thud of my footsteps echoing hollowly throughout the deserted stairwell. The exact moment I finally pushed past the main hospital entrance, a blast of freezing winter air violently whipped against my face. Only then did my legs completely lose their strength, causing me to halt. Slumping against the freezing brick exterior, I slowly slid down onto the cold concrete. Then I raised both of my trembling hands to tightly mask my face, my shoulders violently convulsing as the dam finally broke. Not a single audible sob escaped my throat. There were only massive heavy tears, surging uncontrollably through the gaps of my fingers, splattering heavily against the frozen ground below. It wasn't that my heart didn't ache with profound misery. It was simply that some bridges are burned so completely there is absolutely no going back. Several agonizing hours later, the blinding red warning light above the operating room finally flickered off. The lead surgeon stepped out into the corridor, his expression thoroughly exhausted, yet laced with profound relief. The patient is incredibly lucky. The blade missed her vital cardiac arteries by a matter of mere centimeters. She suffered a catastrophic loss of blood, but our emergency resuscitation efforts were perfectly timed. She is officially out of any immediate life-threatening danger. Soon after, Jian Shijie was carefully rolled out of the ICU and transferred to a private suite. By the time the heavy anesthesia completely wore off, it was already late the following afternoon. The absolute exact microsecond, her consciousness flooded back. A white-hot, agonizing wave of pain exploded across her entire back. Yet completely ignoring the physical trauma, her eyelids violently snapped open, her vocal cords producing a raw, desperately raspy shriek. Mufang, where is Mufang? Where on earth is Mufang? It. My father and mother, who had been anxiously keeping vigil at her bedside, exchanged guilty glances, their eyes shifting away in absolute avoidance. Jian Shijie's heart instantaneously plummeted into a bottomless abyss, a suffocating apocalyptic wave of pure dread paralyzing her entire soul in an instant. She violently forced her torso upright into a sitting position, paying absolutely zero mind to the agonizing sensation of her stitched flesh ripping apart. And with a brutal yank, she aggressively ripped the IV line right out from the back of her hand. As a sudden spurt of fresh crimson blood pooled out, she screamed, "Did he abandon me? Did he seriously leave me all over again?" Her voice aggressively spiked to a manic register, completely distorted by a volatile cocktail of hysteric agitation and deep-seated terror. Her eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a manic crimson fury, behaving exactly like a thoroughly cornered, desperate beast. Answer me. Did he decide that he genuinely doesn't want anything to do with me ever again? My mother was thoroughly paralyzed with fear by her completely unhinged display. Choking out amidst her tears, "Shiji, please, I beg you, calm down. You need to focus on healing your catastrophic wounds first. Mufeng, he officially packed his things and left. He said what?" Jian Shijie violently lunged forward, gripping my mother's forearm with a vice-like hold, exerting a localized force so incredibly brutal it felt as though she might literally shatter the bone. My mother's face instantly drained of all color from the agonizing grip, her voice trembling violently. "He explicitly warned us never to dare look for him again." Her fingers slowly completely lost all their strength, limply sliding off my mother's arm, as she stared blankly up at the sterile, stark white ceiling tiles. And out of nowhere, a low guttural chuckle began to ripple from her throat. The hollow laughter sounded incredibly raspy, distorted, and sickening to the ear, gradually escalating in volume and intensity, before ultimately transforming into a full-blown maniacal roar of absolute insanity. Laughing so violently that heavy tears began to cascade down her cheeks. "I owe him a life. I owe him an innocent, unborn child. I owe him 5 entire years of his beautiful, wasted youth. And I owe him for the countless times I inflicted brutal trauma and ultimate betrayal on his soul." She kept mindlessly repeating the devastating list over and over again, her gaze completely vacant and shattered. How on earth do I ever repay that debt? What? How can I possibly make things right with him now? He won't even grant me the basic luxury of a single chance to redeem myself to him ever again. Ha ha ha! Alerted by the chaotic noise, a team of emergency physicians and nurses burst into the room, forcefully pinning down her wildly thrashing, emotionally compromised frame, before instantly administering a heavy dose of a potent chemical sedative. Under the aggressive, overwhelming suppression of the narcotics, Jian Shijie's spastic movements gradually began to go completely limp. Yet her unblinking eyes remained wide open, staring hollowly into the absolute emptiness of the ceiling above. Heavy tears silently traced a path down her pale skin, disappearing quietly into her hairline. She had lost suffering in absolute and utterly catastrophic defeat, realizing that even putting her entire life on the line couldn't buy back a single glance from him. The exact moment Jian Shijie recovered from her wound and left the hospital, she transformed into a completely different person. She completely ceased any pathetic attempts to aggressively force herself into my space, choosing instead to silently hover on the absolute periphery of my daily life, attempting to atone for her sins in a manner that was bordering on pure self-torture. Every single morning, right outside the threshold of my apartment door, a pristine bouquet would materialize precisely on time, freshly picked sunflowers glittering with morning dew. Upon swinging the door open and spotting them, I would indifferently hoist the entire arrangement, before casually chucking it into the garbage chute at the far end of the hallway. The cozy local cafe where I used to work part-time had quietly and anonymously undergone a total change in corporate ownership. The entire aesthetic was completely overhauled from its original cold industrial look into the exact setup I had once, carelessly described in passing a warm, beautifully illuminated natural wood design. The general manager, sporting a massive grin, officially declared that my hourly wage was being instantly tripled. The very next afternoon, I calmly handed in my official resignation letter. Even the Language Institute where I was studying French suddenly received an anonymous, staggeringly massive financial endowment, with the solitary stipulation that a specific student by the name of Kim Mufeng must have his entire tuition completely waived. Exactly 1 week later, the school board officially processed a full refund request, accompanied by a blunt note stating that such charity was entirely unnecessary. Whenever I came down with a minor cold or a lingering cough, the threshold of my apartment would mysteriously play host to perfectly targeted prescription medications and freshly brewed raw candy pear soup. I never laid a single finger on any of it, leaving the items to sit right outside the door until they completely spoiled, only to be swept away as hazardous waste by the building's janitorial staff. Jian Shiji lived her life exactly like a lingering phantom, omnipresent in my reality, yet deliberately ensuring she never once showed her face. The unforgiving winter season in Montreal was brutal and agonizingly drawn out, and a massive unexpected blizzard abruptly paralyzed the entire city. Trapped inside my apartment, I suffered a catastrophic fever and completely lost consciousness. Zhou Xinyan found herself completely unable to establish contact with me, and in a frantic state of pure panic, she dialed the emergency number Jian Shijie had left behind. The instant Jian Shijie forcefully smashed through the deadbolt and broken into the room, my consciousness had already faded into a complete blur, my cheeks burning a violent, feverish crimson. Inside the hospital ward, she kept an agonizing vigil for 3 whole days and nights, refusing to leave my bedside for even a single second. The moment I finally blinked my eyes open, I locked sight on the hollow-eyed woman resting by the mattress. Yet my gaze remained as perfectly still and dead as a stagnant well. "Thank you," I calmly muttered, my vocal cords incredibly raspy and dry. "Just tell me the exact total of the medical expenses and I will reimburse you entirely." Jian Shiji's lips twitched slightly as she attempted to force a smile. Yet that tragic expression looked far more agonizing than a full-blown miserable sob. "Mufeng, do you truly find it completely necessary to draw such an absolute clinical line between us? We don't actually belong in each other's lives anyway," I indifferently countered, deliberately shifting my gaze entirely away from her face. Jian Shijie felt as if her heart had just been violently bludgeoned, blunt by a blunt, heavy iron weapon. She stared down at my frozen frame for a few agonizing seconds, before abruptly spinning around to stumble and stagger her way out of the medical suite. Outside the facility, a catastrophic blizzard was howling fiercely, dumping thick blankets of ice. She marched out and dropped straight onto her knees, groveling rigidly in the deep snowbank right outside the main clinic doors. The sub-zero winter wind whipped the icy snowflakes through the air, slicing against her exposed skin like a flurry of razor-sharp tactical daggers. Dozens of passing pedestrians stopped to gawk and point their fingers at the bizarre spectacle. Yet she remained completely oblivious to the crowd, acting as if she were trapped in a vacuum. Zhou Xinyan frantically sprinted out after her, violently pulling at her coat. "Jian Shijie, have you completely lost your mind?" Jian Shiji merely shook her head in absolute numbness, her frostbitten lips twitching as she whispered a single fragmented sentence. "This is the insurmountable debt that I forever owe him." And so she remained stubbornly pinned to that exact spot on her knees, enduring the freeze from the fading dusk through the dead of night and all the way until the crack of dawn, until her physical reserves were entirely completely depleted, causing her rigid torso to collapse face first into the thick freezing layers of accumulation. Meanwhile, my biological father and mother were also desperately employing their own toxic methods to beg for absolution. They set up a miserable vigil right beneath the complex of my newly leased apartment, waiting idly for an entire grueling day. The exact moment they spotted their biological son returning home from a long shift at work, my mother frantically lunged forward and aggressively dropped directly onto the icy concrete, viciously locking her arms around my legs as she wailed in a devastating, heart-wrenching sob. "Mufeng, your mother was wrong. I finally see my horrific sins. Please, I beg of you, just come back home with your mother. From this second onward, your mom will protect and cherish you with her entire life." Mrs. Kin, I am asking you to kindly maintain your dignity. My father, with tears of absolute misery pouring down his wrinkled face likewise, dropped heavily to his knees, brutally smashing his forehead directly against the freezing stone tiles, the sickening heavy thud echoing across the pavement as he groveled. Your dad will kowtow and beg for your mercy until my head bleeds. Please just find it in your heart to forgive your father and mother. I quietly stood there, witnessing this pathetic, dramatic circus unfold before my eyes, my gaze completely vacant and dead. In the past, you used cheap familial bonds to emotionally blackmail me. My voice sounded incredibly soft and airy, yet every single syllable sliced through the air like a lethal weapon piercing their souls. And now you've simply decided to use your pathetic guilt to hold me hostage instead. Your supposed love and protection were lavished entirely upon Qin Huan. And now that you suddenly regret your actions, am I automatically supposed to feel overwhelmed with gratitude and run back to your mansion? I let out a hollow chuckle as a heavy tear silently traced down my cheek. It is way too damn late. From the absolute tragic moment you chose to abandon me, you completely forfeited the right to ever call yourselves my parents. That signed legal document severing our ties was the absolute final shred of dignity. Never dare to interfere with my life again. I turned around, stepping past the threshold and shutting the door, effectively locking their heart-wrenching, agonizing wails on the outside. Pressing my spine against the freezing surface of the door, I slowly slid down until I was collapsed onto the floor, burying my face deeply between my knees. Not a single sound escaped my throat. There was only the silent, violent shuddering of my shoulders. It wasn't that the agony had vanished, but rather that the deep trauma had long since festered, leaving a permanent scar that would absolutely never heal. 4 grueling months later, the beautiful spring season finally arrived in Montreal, and my daily existence had successfully transitioned back onto the right track. My French had become exceptionally fluent, and I secured an incredibly solid job working as a professional translator. A faint, genuine smile would occasionally flicker across my face during work hours. Meanwhile, Zhou Xinyan and I were rapidly growing closer and closer, frequently grabbing dinner and catching the latest movies together. The gaze she directed toward me was always incredibly tender and completely focused. From a distance, Jian Shiji watched our interactions unfold, a toxic jealousy viciously gnawing at her heart, yet she never dared to take a single step forward. Until that fateful day when a colleague casually mentioned, "Hey, CEO Jian, it looks like your former fiancé is about to be proposed to." The fragile emotional string that had been stretched to its absolute limit inside Jian Shijie's mind abruptly snapped with a violent pop. She frantically stormed toward that upscale riverside restaurant, only to lock eyes on Zhou Xinyan holding my hand as we walked out together, both of our faces illuminated with radiant, happy smiles. In that exact microsecond, her entire world completely lost its color, bleaching into a monochrome void save for that blindingly painful sight. She aggressively charged forward and violently ripped Zhou Xinyan away from me, glaring at me with bloodshot, psychotic eyes. "Are you seriously going to marry her?" I knit my brows together in deep disgust. "That has absolutely nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with me." Jian Shiji let out a desperate, completely unhinged laugh. "You are my fiancé. Whatever existed between us is already completely over. I never consented to that." She let out a guttural shriek, violently dragging me along as she moved. The moment Zhou Xinyan stepped up to block her path, she was met with a brutal, vicious strike that forcefully sent her reeling. The two women instantly locked into a chaotic, violent brawl right along the riverbank. Jian Shiji fought exactly like a thoroughly unhinged feral beast, ultimately bludgeoning Zhou Xinyan into absolute unconsciousness on the concrete. She then aggressively dragged Qin Mufang toward the heavy guardrails overlooking the water. The heavy night sky hung low over the horizon, casting the rushing river below into a pitch-black abyss. If I were to plunge into the depths and end my life right now, she stared directly into my frozen dead eyes and suddenly burst into a hollow laugh. Her expression completely fractured. "If I do, will you finally find it in your heart to forgive me?" "Never," my voice cut through the air without a single ripple of emotion. "Even if you died right here, the only thing I would feel is absolute sweet relief." "Perfect," Jian Shijie nodded, her eyes flashing with a terrifying suicidal resolve. "Then I will gladly die for you." Before the final syllable could even echo through the night air, she aggressively launched her torso over the concrete guardrail, plunging headfirst into the sub-zero depths of the dark St. Lawrence River. "Jian Shiji," my pupils violently contracted in absolute horror, and I desperately lunged over the freezing metal barrier. But the pitch-black surface of the water was already flattening out into silent ripples. A profound icy dread completely paralyzed my entire body, my hands shaking violently as I scrambled to pull out my phone to dial emergency services. Yet my fingers were so stiff from the cold and panic they refused to obey my brain. "Mufeng," a faint shivering voice suddenly drifted up from the dark abyss below. Jian Shijie was desperately clinging to the rough concrete of the bridge pillar, half of her body completely submerged in the agonizingly glacial piercing water, straining her neck to look up at me. Her face appeared a ghostly petrified white under the dim moonlight. "Look at me," I'm completely willing to end my life right now, just for you. You are completely psychotic. Get back up here right now. I furiously screamed down at the freezing void. The very second you grant me your absolute forgiveness, I will climb back up. Are you seriously trying to blackmail me? Her voice shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor, though it was impossible to tell if it was from the hypothermia or pure, unadulterated despair. Qin Mufeng, I am officially using my own life as leverage against you. You either forgive my sins and come back home with me right now, or you can watch me die in this freezing abyss. The violent current surged aggressively, and the fingers she had locked onto the concrete pillar were rapidly turning a bloodless, stark white. Get up here. I'll stop dialing the police, just get up. I need you to say you forgive me. That is absolutely never going to happen. Jian Shijie let out one final hollow laugh, an expression that looked utterly devastating and pathetic under the dim streetlights, yet radiating a pure chilling insanity. Then I guess this is where it ends. She completely released her grip on the pillar, allowing her rigid torso to slide backward, instantly vanishing beneath the swirling vortex of the pitch-black river. In our next life, I swear to God, I will treat you right. I remained completely paralyzed against the guardrail, staring blankly into the vast consuming darkness that had just devoured her entire existence. The blood running through my veins turning completely to ice. The fabric of time itself felt as if it had ground to an absolute halt, with nothing but the roaring, indifferent rush of the river filling the silence. A few agonizing seconds later, I sharply spun around on my heel, stumbling and staggering toward the unconscious form of Zhou Xinyan. I scooped up the smartphone she had dropped on the concrete, my hand shaking violently as I forced my fingers to dial 911 for an ambulance. And from the absolute beginning to the very end of that nightmare, I never once cast a single glance back toward the dark water. The shrill wail of police sirens and blaring ambulances echoed from afar, rapidly closing in. I refused to look back even once. Eventually, Jian Shijie was dragged out of the water. The freezing torrent didn't claim her pathetic life, but it permanently washed away the very last traces of her toxic insanity. She remained bedridden in the hospital ward for half a month, and after her official discharge, her entire personality underwent a radical transformation. She completely ceased her obsessive stalking and harassment, deliberately ensuring she never again crossed directly into my field of vision. Instead, just 2 blocks away from my current apartment complex, she quietly purchased a quaint little storefront and established a low-key rustic cafe. The name of the establishment was chillingly simple. Waiting, she personally mastered the art of brewing artisanal espresso, perfecting latte art and baking basic delicate pastries. Stripping away her ultra-expensive designer dresses, she regularly dressed in plain cotton and linen shirts. Not a single trace of the powerful high society Jian family heiress remained in her demeanor. She looked exactly like a genuine, hard-working cafe owner, quiet, deeply introverted, with eyes that were entirely dead and solemn. She had finally learned the true meaning of boundaries and respect. Knowing that I thoroughly detested the sight of her, she stayed completely hidden though. Whenever roadblocks threatened my career, she would manipulate things from the shadows to resolve them, leaving absolutely zero evidence behind. As long as my daily existence remained perfectly peaceful and prosperous, she was entirely content to merely watch from afar. Meanwhile, my biological parents finally fled back home. Every single year on the exact anniversary of my birth, a staggeringly massive wire transfer would materialize precisely on time in my bank account. I never touched a single cent of it, nor did I ever bother to inquire about them. My mother spiraled into a catastrophic clinical depression, spending her entire days weeping over a faded, blurry childhood photo of me. My father's hair turned stark white virtually overnight, rendering him a frail, decrepit old man. Soon after news of Qin Huaan's horrific downfall reached me, Jian Shiji had systematically compiled every single shred of his criminal behavior, including corporate espionage, grand fraud, and the malicious fabrication of medical records, and delivered the flawlessly organized dossiers directly to the police department. With the overwhelming mountain of irrefutable evidence, Qin Huaan was brutally thrown behind bars to rot. Word from the prison yard claimed he completely lost his mind, mindlessly babbling all day that he was the rightful young master of the legendary Qin family, and the absolute undeniable fiancé of Jian Shijie. He received 0 visitors, and his name was completely erased from anyone's memory after permanently embedding myself in Montreal for a full year. Zhou Xinyan and I officially tied the knot. The wedding ceremony was wonderfully simple, elegant, and deeply intimate, attended only by a very select handful of our closest companions. Naturally, Jian Shijie never received an invitation to the venue, but Jian Shijie didn't receive a single wedding invitation or notification. On the day of our wedding, she completely shut down her shop, spending the entire day sitting silently by the banks of the St. Lawrence River, watching the setting sun bleed a vibrant liquid gold across the rushing water, and then watching that golden hue slowly drain away as the cold night sky took over. She didn't shed a single tear. She simply sat there in absolute stillness, resembling nothing more than a silent, hollow statue. Years passed, and my daily existence became incredibly peaceful, filled with genuine happiness. Occasionally on a lazy weekend afternoon, I would visit the local bookstore situated directly across the street from Cafe Waiting. I'd order a refreshing hot fruit tea, claim a cozy window seat, and lose myself in a book for hours on end. Meanwhile, shielded behind the large glass window pane of her cafe, Jian Shijie would quietly focus on brewing her artisanal espresso, methodically wiping down the porcelain cups, before softly lifting her head to let her gaze drift across the bustling street, permanently anchoring her eyes on that peaceful figure sitting right by the bookstore window. The warm afternoon sunlight danced softly through the glass, illuminating the tips of my hair. I would tilt my head down slightly, my long eyelashes casting a faint, delicate shadow right beneath my eyes, completely absorbed in my reading. We were separated by a single city street, divided by an endless flowing river of pedestrians and passing vehicles, existing exactly like two parallel universes silently revolving in their own orbits, doomed to never cross paths again.